I believe it's 2 o'clock.
Oh, yeah, I felt a lot more comfortable.
You all settle down. It is Tuesday, May 23rd at 2 o'clock. This is a joint workshop of the Indian River County Board of County Commissioners and the Indian River County Planning and Zoning Commissioners. Call to order. Pledge of Allegiance will be by Vice Chairman Gary Wheeler, and the invocation will be by Stan Bowling, our Planning Director.
Can we vote on that?
Yes. You first.
Golly, you're right. Take the flag, please. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. Bowling? Want to stop?
In honor of Mr. Sent, we can all stay seated and we can pray with me if you would. Father God, we want to thank you for this afternoon. We are mindful of the fact that we are not really in control, that you have given us charge over things for a period of time. And we need your wisdom, we need your courage, we need your insight to lead in those areas and to follow in those areas that we've been given charge of for a while. And in that spirit, we ask you for wisdom and discernment and for knowledge this afternoon. And we give you thanks for the opportunity to come together to do that in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, item 4 is a presentation of traffic impact and roadway concurrency study, draft report by John Kim, P.E. with McMahon Associates. And I assume he's going to introduce Mr. McMahon of McMahon Associates.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chair, my name is John.
You need to turn it on.
That's it? John Kim with McMahon Associates. With me is Mr. Joseph McMahon, CEO of McMahon Associates.
Good afternoon.
We are truly impressed.
Don't be.
Well, you just came here from Fort Pierce, is that?
I'll go ahead and begin. As you know, we conducted a study of your code and did a comparison with 5 other counties in South Florida in order to compare and, if you will, contrast and make recommendations to changes in your code. I think in the interest of time, I'd like to get to the recommendations as quickly as possible. I understand you've had a number of meetings today, so I'll go relatively quickly through the beginning of the PowerPoint presentation, just to really give you an overview of the scope and what was done. The scope of work specific for this project was really to look at certain sections of your code, specifically dealing with concurrency management, your roadway level of service standards, traffic impact study requirements and procedures, road improvement design with respect to improvements required for new development, and also access control in terms of access management. The 5 comparison counties were Collier, Martin, Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, and Sarasota. This is a map that gives you a general idea of where those counties are with respect to Indian River being the northernmost county. You can stop me at any time you like. I'm just trying to get to the recommendation section. The areas of concern were also stipulated in the scope. Again, generally, without reading each one, it really was to go over, really from a land development perspective, in terms of your concurrency management system, required roadway or intersection improvements, elements of traffic impact studies such as trip generation, pass-by, your timetable for vesting or reservation, if you will, of the concurrency approvals, impact area calculation, what capacity standards should be used, and just briefly going over each one. Traffic impact studies, right now the county requires them for all zoning and land development projects. You do require methodology meeting as a standard. You have a report that is standardized in your code, pretty specific, which is definitely not what other counties are doing, so that's definitely a very good thing. Your radius of influence in terms of what roadways and intersections need to be analyzed are also relatively conservative. Your trip generation, like many of the other counties, compared to use ITE, Alternate sources typically consist of doing 3 comparative sites and coming up with a trip generation for things that are not included within ITE. Your pass-by is stipulated in your code by land use. You do not rely on ITE. I'm sorry, for those of you who don't know, ITE is the Institute of Transportation Engineers, nationally recognized organization. Internalization, you also pretty much have a cap, a standard, if you will, for large mixed-use developments. You do a PM peak hour, peak season directional analysis, and your distribution, as I understand it, is pretty much based on your regional planning model. In terms of capacity, you do adopt FDOT generalized capacity tables from their 2002 Quality of Service Manual. Your LOSC for rural, LOSD for urban. You don't have in place, as I understand it, any allowances to exceed those level of service thresholds, with the exception of doing arterial analysis for major roadways. And you do apply a background growth rate to account for projects that have been approved but are not, quote unquote, or in the system, I should say, but not approved yet. In terms of your concurrency process, unlike many of the other counties that we looked at, Indian River County does not allow for a de minimis. You have no urban infill areas in the county, and there are no traffic concurrency exception areas that I am aware of. Your timing of reservation, as everyone is well aware of, has changed recently to be required at the time of the building permit application, I believe. You do require the payment of all impact fees at that time. You have quite an impeccable concurrency database system, which I believe is probably the most complete of all the counties we reviewed. And your proportionate fair share ordinance, as I found out in interviewing the other counties, you are the only county that I am aware of that has adopted the new proportionate fair share ordinance. Many of the other counties I spoke to hadn't even really begun yet. That may have been, as terms of like as of a month ago. I don't know what's happened since then, but you guys are definitely, up on that aspect.
Do that too.
Your data collection is not unlike many of the other counties, with the exception, I think, that most counties enter their information and make it active for one point in the year. I think Indian River sort of comes in as whenever you count them, they get put into the system. They are adjusted for peak season and updated on a monthly basis generally, which again is something pretty, I would say, I guess much more current than your fellow counties, if you will. For roadway improvements, you do specify minimum right turn, left turn lane thresholds for requiring new development to provide those types of exclusive lanes. Your mitigation, which is not unlike other counties, include roadway widening, retiming or rephasing of major signalized intersections, and also in terms of intersection improvements such as adding turn lanes and whatnot. You do rely on FDOT access management standards for the most part. Your drive-in lane standards are pretty specific and do enumerate a number of different uses, which is somewhat in contrast to what other counties do. And you have, I believe, a set minimum for gated residential community stacking length. The reason those are there is because a survey was done and approved by staff, which is what I went to the other counties with, and those were some of the things that were brought up as potential areas of concern. Now we come to the recommendations, and I don't know if you want me to read each one. Would that make it easier for everyone?
Well, I don't think you need to read it verbatim. We can all see that, but just give us a little synopsis of what.
Okay. Well, right now, what we refer to as a radius of influence is basically what roadways have to be analyzed, and in Indian River County, that is, I believe it's either where 5% of your project will be assigned to a road, or where you have 5 peak hour, peak direction trips, which is pretty conservative. I provided you with a graphic. It looks pretty much like a checkerboard. County staff recommended I do something like this to really put it in perspective for you. I've done 2 examples, one having it should look like a grid, basically. The first one uses an example of 125 single-family dwelling units. And you notice there are 4 colors. I've used 5 different levels of criteria to establish a radius of influence. And each square, by the way, is 1 mile. And understand also, this pattern is really based on, because I pretty much just went from the site outward equally in terms of my distribution. So normally with a project, it would favor major, minor roads and whatnot. So this is pretty uniform. You'll notice that the red, which is basically all 4 roadways within proximity of the site, is what you would be required if you were to establish a 2%. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go ahead and bring it up here. Make it easier for everyone. Shortcut. There you go. Okay. This is the example using 125 residential dwelling units. You notice that if we presume a 2% level service criteria, meaning that if your impact is 2% or more of level service D, you would be required in this instance to look at these 4 in the middle, or basically the 4 that are within a mile of the site, if you will. If you were to go forward with a 1% level service D, you'll see how it goes out to more or less about 2 miles from the site, and those are all in blue. Now, I went ahead and took your current criteria, which is 5 peak hour directional trips, and you'll see how that takes me well beyond, probably in the realm of 5 miles from the site. This really is more for a comparative, review. It's really up to this board to decide how conservative they want to be. Right now, I have to say that you have to be the most conservative in terms of your area of influence. I mean, I've never seen something that generates this sort of, I guess, for lack of a better word, analysis than Indian River County. 5 peak hour trips is quite considerable and takes you out quite a ways from your site. And that's not to say it's a bad thing. I'm just letting you know, relatively speaking. Some of the other counties that I reviewed were doing 1%, 2%. Some counties actually have, like Palm Beach has, a table that says if you generate 50 peak hour trips or less, you'll have a half-mile radius of influence. If it's 51 to 100, it's 1 mile, et cetera, et cetera. We thought that really basing it on a percentage of the level of service would vary it from roadway to roadway.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
So when you say we're being conservative with our approach, that means that we are applying the numbers very liberally throughout a large system.
No, very
I
conservative.
think by conservative, I mean you're making sure that they review a wide area.
A wide area.
You're not letting them, quote unquote, do just a 1 mile radius or 2 mile radius. You want wherever 5 cars in one direction are going to travel during the peak hour.
So you're looking at liberal, conservative.
Let me show you
Help me,
the.
Gary, help me.
I think you got confused there.
Let me show you also an example. And remember, it's only 125 units. The next example uses 60,000 square feet of general retail. Applying your allowable pass-by, which basically is a discount, if you will. If it generated, let's say, 600 trips, what you'd actually have to analyze would be for 300. And again, you see a major difference. Now, you'll see that here, I'm getting about a 2 mile radius just using a 2% level of service. The blue is the 1% level service D, and then you have Indian River County, which, again, 5 peak hour trips takes you out very far from the site, probably in excess of 5 miles.
Okay.
So it's really, all these recommendations, I should note also, are really judgment calls in terms of how conservative you want to be as a county. So I want to make it clear, I wrote what I collectively sat down with my CEO and 2 other senior staff in my office to really juggle what we thought the best practice would be. But my understanding is you really have to decide for yourself how conservative you want to be. So I just wanted to just mention that before I continue.
If I could just comment a little bit on that, since John referred to me. A shopping center of about 100,000 square feet, we've studied in urban areas that 85% of the trips are satisfied within a 2 mile radius. So this is 60,000 square feet, and your requirements are to take it for at least a 5 mile radius to look at an area. And if it was a 100,000 square foot center, 85% of those trips would be accommodated within a radius of 2 miles of the site.
Why would they call it a regional shopping center if 85% of them were within 2 miles?
Well, the ULI codes, I would say that would be classified as a neighborhood shopping center. There's neighborhood, community, and regional. 100,000 square feet, I think, is still within the neighborhood center. It'd be anchored by, say, a public supermarket.
Well, I can assure you, if I used a 200,000 square foot retail, you'd be out beyond 12 miles.
I was saying 100,000 square
I'm
foot.
saying that if you go to a regional, I mean, you'd be going way out there.
Okay.
This is just 60,000.
Okay.
So here what we're recommending basically is using a 2% level service. I keep saying level service, but if you impact a roadway, if your impact on that road is 2% of its level service or more, in other words, if it were 600 trip limit, then 2% of that would be 12. So you would have to analyze everywhere where you had 12 or more peak hour directional trips on a roadway. Those are the roadways you would be required to review, or analyze rather. The next one deals with the analyzing of intersections. Currently, your code requires that if you are impacting, again, if your impact on a roadway is 2% of what level service C is, okay, then you would be required to analyze that intersection. What we're recommending is that you basically require wherever a project is significant on a roadway, that if either one of if those roadways are within 10% of reaching their capacity, then you should be required to analyze intersections at each end of that link. The idea being that typically intersections are reaching failure when the roadways are getting close to capacity. So if the roadway is a good indicator of whether or not you should have to analyze the intersection. So basically I'm saying that if the road were at 90% or more of its capacity, then you would be required to analyze each end in terms of the intersections. No, well right now what you do is 2% of level service C, whatever that would be.
If a road is at 2% of level service C.
If your impact is 2% of level service C, then you would be required to look at the intersection. Even if the roadway's capacity is level service D, you're using C as sort of the threshold.
So does that mean that what you're recommending here, just to help me understand this, is more restrictive, or as you say, conservative, or is our current policy more conservative?
Yeah, how does the level of capacity relate to within certain...
And you're using two...
percentage of its...
Right.
You're using apples on one and oranges on the other, not even making a determination of which one's best.
Chris can help you.
Chris, you going to tell us?
What? I don't know if I have an answer for. Maybe Joe wants to help me here, but
Yes. It would be depend. What you're trying to find out are where are the roads and the intersections that you're approaching capacity, and a relatively small impact is going to give you a problem.
Right.
What we're trying to do is making sure that with going to a 2% level, that kind of makes it less restrictive. Let's say, rather than liberal and conservative. So that would give you a little more latitude. However, we want to make sure that we still catch those areas that are fragile in terms of reaching a point where you're going to need improvements.
So our current policy is more restrictive than what you're talking about, but there's no safeguard to ensure, or as a trip, if you will, to determine when we look at the intersections based on the capacity of the roads.
Yes.
correct. It's not relative to capacity.
Yeah, Chris Mora, County Traffic Engineer. What they're proposing is much less restrictive than what we currently do.
All right.
Right now, when we look at intersections or determine which intersections need to be looked at, we don't even look at the range of capacity that link is at. We don't care if it's 90%, 80%, 70%. We only look at the project traffic approaching an intersection. And if it's at 2% of LOSC, then we make them analyze that intersection. What McMahon is saying is until a roadway link or segment is 90% or above, That's the point in which you have to analyze the intersections on each end.
Okay.
So right now, we analyze many, many more intersections than what we would have to if we adopted this new standard.
Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead and move on. Another recommendation, I know this may not be a popular one with staff, but right now Indian River County only looks at PM peak hour. What we're proposing is that you require as a minimum AM and PM peak hour, peak season directional volumes. And also for those instances where you have either developments of regional impacts or things of significant size that may change when the actual peak hour occurs, because currently it's 7 to 9 in the morning, 4 to 6 in the afternoon. We want to sort of give you that flexibility that in cases where you feel that there should be a different analysis done because this large land development project is going to change when the peak hour occurs, you'd be allowed that flexibility. Now, again, this recommendation entails quite a bit on your part because, I mean, doing just PM peak hour is enough work in and of itself, I'm sure Chris will tell you. Adding AM into the mix just doubles that work. And I guess furthermore, if there were a specific project that came in where it was a different peak hour, again, there would be a lot of work done by the consultant, but also a lot of work done on the part of the county to review it and make sure it was right. So understand that what I'm recommending here is a better practice, but it is going to entail some commitment from the county.
Mr. Chairman.
Mm-hmm. Just jump in.
So, okay, so a good example here is somewhere around Sebastian River High School, Sebastian River Middle School, and Sebastian, or now the Treasure Coast Elementary. Clearly, the
Correct.
PM peak hour is useless.
Correct.
I mean, but the worst time to drive through there is, it's 7:30 in the morning.
Correct.
And so, right now, is there a way of, I suppose, sprinkling, just instead of a program, more sprinkle some common sense into it and just look at the area somehow and say, okay, this is not the best time of day to count traffic, versus just having the blanket policy. And I don't know where else we would have that situation, but the schools just jump out in my mind because I see it all the time.
Well, peak hour doesn't have to be 7 to 9 and 4 to 6. It can be whatever the school's closed, 3 to 4 or whatever.
But that's instead of just requiring staff to do 2 programs, is there a way of just looking at it with a little bit of common sense and thinking, okay, when is the most traffic here? And instead of it being a PM, and assuming that's the time of the day we're going to have the most amount of traffic, do it not PM, but peak hour, just whenever peak hour is.
Well, and that point's well taken. The other point with regard to saying both AM and PM, if you have an office complex, for example, when people are coming in the morning, that might impact left turn lanes, for example, that might need, instead of a single left, you might need a double left to get in there.
Gotcha.
But if you only look at the afternoon peak hour when it's heavily directional coming out,
Gotcha.
then you might miss something that you need to prepare for. And the converse is true for residential development. In the morning, everybody's coming out and going to work. In the afternoon, they're more coming home. So you want to make sure that you catch those. So that's the other reason for saying look at both the AM and the PM. And the other example of a major shopping center is that, a Friday night or a Saturday afternoon might have heavier traffic than an AM or PM during a weekday even. So we just want to point out that you want to at least do that evaluation to make sure the particular project, the idea is to try to make sure that when you add up existing traffic, projected traffic, and then the development related traffic, you catch the worst case situation for whatever might be needed.
Also the time of year. Schools aren't in 12 months a year, and neither is season 12 months a year.
Yeah.
So is that factored into the equation at all?
We talk about using peak season, peak hour as the basis. And a couple of the recommendations later on will address that as well.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask Chris a question?
Yes, you may.
Chris, in something like this, I'm leaning towards liking that, but I guess my question to you is the juice worth the squeeze to get there?
Well, one of the issues that we've looked at is we do have AM and PM peak hour in our code currently. We have historically only looked at PM peak hour because 2 reasons basically. Historically, the PM peak hour has been larger than the AM peak hour. All of our counts bear that out on all the major roads. The second reason, and more importantly, is our entire concurrency management system, which includes existing counts, vested trips from projects. are all done in the PM peak hour, because again, historically, that's been the larger. We do not have an AM peak hour or a noon peak hour or any other peak hour of the day concurrency management system. We don't know right now what the vested trips would be for an alternative peak hour analysis. So what we're thinking of doing is perhaps looking at intersections or looking at links or having consultants look at other intersections during an alternative peak, such as the AM peak, but not look at it on the basis of concurrency, because again, we don't know what the vested trips would be other than in the PM peak hour.
So, to clarify this, do you build for peak?
We analyze the PM peak hour because, again, historically, that's been the
I got
highest.
that. I got that far. But in schools, we build for peak population,
Right.
which you were referring to.
Right.
You've got to have the seat there for the child when the child shows up. Okay, do you have to have the roadway there when the car shows up? Do we build for peak load?
Yes, we do. But we're assuming that if a PM peak hour analysis tells us that turn lanes or a wider roadway is needed, then it's probably going to be needed for the AM peak also, but in the other direction, because the flows tend to reverse themselves. 510 is busier eastbound in the morning and busier westbound in the afternoon. If the PM peak tells us that 510 needs to be 2 lanes westbound in the afternoon or a 4-lane road, then the AM peak will be covered when we put in the eastbound 2 lanes. So what we're thinking is having the consultants look at the AM peak hour, not on the basis of concurrency, but on the basis of traffic operations. Do traffic counts, see if turn lanes are needed, somehow look at it on that basis rather than concurrency, but keep concurrency in the PM peak hour, because, again, historically, that's been the heaviest hour.
And what I'm hearing you say then is that would probably address the concerns that we have without having to lift up the radiator cap and replace the whole car of the system that we have in place.
I've done that.
Okay.
I thought we were talking about oranges and...
Good old cars too.
He's got a whole wire in it.
The real challenge with the AM is trying to quantify what is in the database. Since you only track PM, it would be quite a chore if I came in with a school and Chris couldn't provide. I could do traffic counts and whatnot and account for what's there today. There'd be no way for Chris to, or it'd be an arduous process for Chris or his staff to tell me, if there are 322 peak hour trips assigned to a link from previously approved projects, okay, what is that in the AM? And the only way to know that is to do a trip generation, do the whole study that was done by the consultant in the PM, and also do the AM. So, again, it is a challenge.
Isn't it reasonable to assume that the people who leave in the morning come home in the evening?
Not necessarily. Especially when you're doing it on directional basis, the whole thing, like Chris says, flips around.
Yeah.
Where you have an early attraction in the morning, you have an early exiting in the afternoon.
all back on the
So you're doing a directional analysis here.
Okay. Continue.
One other thing I noted earlier, you pretty much put a cap on internalization. And we rely, as professionals, we rely quite a bit on ITE for things like trip generation internalization. And what we're recommending here really is that for large projects such as DRIs or things maybe that are just shy of the DRI threshold, you should be allowed to use the ITE matrix, which is found in their trip generation handbook. What it does is it sort of balances out attractions and productions and whatnot and comes up with an internalization based on the land use interaction. It's not very complex. It's really just a spreadsheet. But I noticed that it's something that Indian River County doesn't do, whereas a lot of the other counties actually allow for the IT matrix.
Doesn't it, John, one question, Mr. Chairman, and I guess this would probably fall, the first thing that comes to my mind would be Point West, is they bring the commercial node on track.
Right.
They, in my estimation, should have a credit for any trip that stays within that development, I would imagine.
The question is how much of a credit.
Right.
That
But
ultimately comes.
I think right now we're not looking at that.
Well, I think you are, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's capped off at a solid 10%. Now, depending on what sort of, how much of, let's say, office versus residential you have, it's probably going to be much more than 10%. And there could be other issues. It's a very isolated area in the county. maybe it would be even higher. And I'm not suggesting that you should automatically go higher, but I think as a basis for discussion, you should probably start with the ITE matrix and then negotiate from there, if you will. And that's not to say that whatever drops out of IT, if it says 40%, by no means do I mean to say you guys are bound to it.
Right.
I mean, in my professional career, both in the public and private sector, I prefer the flexibility of being able to ask for things above and beyond the code. I like codes where it tells me, this is our standard, but we reserve the right to ask for more. The impression I got from some staff is like, that sort of, it's, how can I say, it's a bit ambiguous when you go into that realm where you say case-by-case basis or, where deemed appropriate. Those sorts of things I don't feel some of your staff are comfortable with. I personally prefer that, because when I want something in the code, ties my hands not being able to ask for it. Well, when I know the area and I know of a problem, I want to be able to have that flexibility. I don't know.
Staff be, John?
I'm sorry?
Who might that staff be?
I'd rather not say.
That would be me.
But just,
When did you come back?
And the words that he's looking for are arbitrary and capricious. What we like is some standards if you're going to have exceptions. What are the standards for granting an exception?
You came back in a hurry.
I disagree.
If with ITE providing an excellent matrix, that's assuming that the matrix that we use or the system that we have in place falls short substantially for the DRIs or the TNDs.
I wouldn't be prepared to say. I would say that capping it off at 10% to me is I don't want to use the word unreasonable, but 10% is like bare minimum for large land development projects.
We've seen DRIs approved with as high as 44% internalization. Abacoa in northern Palm Beach County is a specific example in the Treasure Coast region that we've seen.
Well, I think we just had, and Gary, you were part of that, we just had this discussion in the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council on, I believe, Kyrie Judge. 10,000, I think, home sites that they were, and John's laughing.
We're involved with that review.
And I mean, it just makes sense when you have something of this size that can begin to capture those internal trips because of the movie theater, the gas stations, and the supermarkets. As opposed to
In some aspects, you're trying to encourage internalization and capture trips internally, so there should be some incentive to want to be able to do that and encourage mixed-use development.
So it's almost like our staff is saying, well,
Conservative.
or liberal.
Or
Restrictive or non-restrictive.
if I may also, I mean, I don't mean to even say, and I got to be careful how I say this, but there is no perfect matrix and there is no perfect distribution. So when you say, and that's why I caution you, when I say IT is a good tool to start from.
Right.
I don't agree with the gentleman there that says, I want a code that I can follow regimentedly.
That's our attorney.
I want to be able to say, you know what, I don't care what the matrix says. It says 47, well, guess what, I'll give you 28. I'm willing to go 28 or 20. There's a certain element of negotiation, I think, that goes on with transportation engineering because it is not an accurate science. And I don't believe it will ever be, and Joe, forgive me, but it is not an exact science. Yeah. And in some cases, I find that it's, the attempt is being made to make it an exact real-time science, which is not what it's intended to be.
Excuse me for just 1 second. There's a point I have to make in doing this thing for 40 years, that what we're trying to do here is predict human behavior. And every one of us that drives knows predicting human behavior on the road can be a very chancy proposition. So we try to use the best tools that we have, if possible, to predict what is going to happen. I think that's the point.
Yeah, and I think what Commissioner Alter mentioned with Callaway Judge Groves, the huge difference between their county and our county. Oh, yeah. When they put in that development, they've got a customer base completely surrounding their project that they're probably going to take a lot of trips off the road that are going east into the city.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Where in our county, we don't have that customer base or surrounded property. So now which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do you build the houses first, or do you build the commercial district first to capture those? So I think it's more experimental in a county our size than it would be in a situation where there's 4,000 acres completely surrounded by residential.
I would recommend following Abacoa's that example where you limit what proportion or disparity there is between residential and commercial.
Well, I think you've got to be able to think outside the box.
I agree. And I prefer, frankly, I prefer having that flexibility.
Sure.
And then one of the requirements in most of these improvements are, if you predict you're going to capture 25 or 30% or some number that's substantially higher than what normally be required, you require, I'm talking about sizable developments now, the Calgary Judges Camp being one of them, that you say, okay, we're going to have you monitor to determine that you in fact are establishing what you say you're going to do. And Abaco, for example, they have a monitoring program where they have to establish what their capture rate is.
Well, I think in a lot of our zoning, we have flexibility. It says up to 6 acres, up to 8 acres, up to, or units per acre. So there's some flexibility there without being capricious.
Mr. Chairman.
Well, I think the whole idea was a 10% cap, though.
Yeah.
That's where the issue lies.
And you may find that that's valid. I'm just providing here, from my experience. You may decide that 10% is more than you want to go.
Why can't, or why wouldn't we, if somebody, when you come before the commission as a DRI or as a TND and approach them basically like a PD, if we're adjusting lot lines and setbacks and all in open space, could that not be another one of the things that we just use in the PD process? Or is this isn't a comp plan?
Yes, you could do that.
Okay. I mean, this is not like a comp plan that would have to be changed. It'd be one of those things that would be give and take as it comes forward, and that wouldn't be arbitrary and capricious.
Right, and each project, if you're going to allow deviation from some 10% fixed internal capture rate to what you actually observe in a project, then you have a basis for deviating. If it really does capture 20%, then you don't want to be set at an arbitrary standard, but you want to reflect the actual happenings on the ground and how people are traveling or not traveling out of the neighborhoods.
I think the whole difference is, number one, you're looking at either a DRI or a TND. These are big to begin with. That's where your difference is.
Yeah.
We're not going to have that many.
Oh, we got a whole bunch.
Yeah. If we do, it'll be 3-2.
Yeah. Now.
Bob Bruce had a comment. It's not on.
That was Gary.
They have it on in the back.
John, why don't you continue with your presentation?
All right.
Sorry.
You have standard subdivisions, and so that's not going to be a PD.
Right.
So, you do need to allow for those areas where you don't have discretionary capability.
But right now, it's our DRIs and our TNDs that do allow for that do cap it at 10%, right?
Right.
Only?
I don't think that we don't allow a traffic retention capability inside of a subdivision or even a planned development. To me, wouldn't meet muster.
Now, we do have internal capture in our code. It's just that it doesn't kick in until something gets to be 250,000 square feet or larger. Well, it has combinations of basically office and retail.
Okay. Right. Which is.
Okay. Next one. My understanding also in Indian River County is that for all projects, you're using the regional plan's transportation model as a basis for your distribution. My experience and the experience of some of the other counties that they do allow.
Anyone has a cell phone on? Just Nick. No, mine's not on. George did it?
Sorry, guys.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Throw your baseball game.
So, in my experience with transportation models, they are good tools, or relatively good tools, for large projects, okay, like developments of regional impact where you have multiple uses and whatnot. But for small, individual units, to use a transportation model really is just not the way to go. Again, you're trying to predict human behavior. A traffic engineer with experience of the area in terms of what land uses are surrounding the site in question are a much better tool, in my opinion, than relying on the model, a regional model for something of a relatively small size, or even a medium size for that matter. So our recommendation here is to permit the use of what we call the manual method, which is basically looking at where the major and minor roads are, where your expressway interchanges are, where your residential versus commercial or office are, and estimate a distribution. And again, give staff the flexibility where, if they want a certain percentage to be put on a road because that's where they believe it should go, by virtue of another study or what have you, then they should have that flexibility, if you will. We don't agree that the regional model is a good tool for those sorts of things. And my understanding is in Indian River County right now, that's pretty much the basis of all your distribution, is to first plug and chug it through the county model. I'll just keep moving. The next couple, I think, are relative to what's referred to as de minimis. There are, I think in the majority of counties I looked at, there is an allowance for de minimis. I believe it's also in the Florida statutes, where I want to say it makes a note of a 1% de minimis level. Indian River County does not have a de minimis level that I am aware of. Every single trip for whatever size project, given the criteria in terms of what roadways and what intersections have to be analyzed, have to be accounted for. And I use the example of Palm Beach County, where if you have a 1% level of or a 1% impact on a road, then you don't have to mitigate that impact on that roadway. Again, your current policy is much more quote-unquote conservative, where you require every trip basically to be analyzed. 5 peak hour directional trips are way below a 1% quote-unquote capacity level. I don't know if Chris wants to comment on that, but the idea was for small projects, and when I say small, I'm talking like maybe a 6 single-family residential unit. I mean, if the roadway in front of them is over capacity, should they not be permitted to develop because of that? I mean, a 6-unit development is not going to be able to mitigate its impact or widen the road on which it has access to.
What about with our pay-as-you-go then? That's kind of what I was under the impression that we were doing, is with the pay-as-you-go allowed a developer, even a small or a large developer, to take care of a link that's a long way away without widening it.
You're talking about proportionate share?
Yes.
Okay, that wasn't adopted when I was going through this study.
Okay.
But I believe, if I'm not mistaken, proportionate share still requires the improvement to be in place within 10 years, I believe.
And financially feasible.
Or financially right.
Right. I mean, there's more than just that. Now, help me with de minimis means, I interpret that, or I've heard staff say, so I've assumed that de minimis means that basically lots, we gave de minimis to those lots that were not platted prior to 1990.
Prior to concurrence. To the adoption of concurrence.
And so we gave them de minimis. And you're saying we are more conservative with our approach because post-1990 we do not grant de minimis.
Correct. You don't grant any de minimis whatsoever.
Okay.
That's at odds with other counties?
Not all of them. I have to look it up, but I know.
In the middle.
I'd say sort of in the middle.
Okay.
We're more on the conservative side. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm trying to think of the solution that you're on the recommendation.
Well, if I may also, there was a bit of a confusion on staff's part, because first we talked about having a 2% radius of influence criteria, and here I am saying, well, grant a 1% de minimis, where 1% doesn't fall within the 2. So my concern there was, in the event that you didn't go with requiring projects that have a 2% for the radius of influence requirement, then if you just kept with what you were going, still have the allowance to have certain projects meet the criteria for de minimis.
On a practical level, how often would you have somebody that has a 6-lot subdivision not be able to do the Senate Bill 360 or the pay-as-you-go and not have something accomplished in 10 years, or as a financially feasible plan? I mean, if you have a 6-unit development that's going to tip the capacity beyond what the infrastructure can support, I'm trying to follow what you're saying, as far as a practical level and out of the abstract realm here, and I don't really see that happening.
I think they can't afford to do the improvements. A small development, you may have an intersection, while a big developer could afford those improvements. A guy that's doing a very small development can't afford to do that intersection for $1 million.
Well, that's what I'm saying. But what is the practicality? I mean, the concern about not providing de minimis for projects post 1990 or not. I just can't see a 6-unit development not being able to do a proportionate share. Help me, Bob.
I'm Bob Keating, County Community Development Director. We've got a couple of flavors of de minimis. We've got de minimis in terms of land use. We're saying a land use which is a single-family house on a lot in a subdivision that was platted before 1990 is de minimis. The impact is so small we're not going to count it. When we're talking about a de minimis amount, a de minimis contribution to a traffic link here, 1% level of service. To give you an idea, the 6-lot subdivision, if you adopt this, we wouldn't be doing studies for 6-lot subdivisions because they're going to have 6 peak hour trips, and at a 1% level of service, even for a 2-lane road, generally you'd have to have a minimum of 8 trips. It's generally 860. To give you an idea, a 4-lane divided road has a level of service at level of service D using the generalized level of service handbook of about 1860. 1% of that is 18 trips. If you have a 1% de minimis, you would not analyze a project that had fewer than 18 trips on a link.
And right now,
is what you're saying.
And right now, our threshold for a traffic study is 1. So a residential house, a residential unit would have to do a traffic study?
No, right now our threshold for analyzing a link, which is what we're talking about here, is 5% or 5 hourly trips. So as opposed to the 18 or 8 that the 1% of LOS would say, we go down much lower than that. We actually go down to 5% or 5 hourly. Now on a small project, 5% of the project traffic could be as small as 1 trip. And sometimes because of that requirement, we make people track all the way down to 1 trip.
What size project would have to do a traffic study?
You'd have to do a traffic study if you're more than 100 daily trips. If you're less than 100 daily trips, like a 6-lot subdivision would be less than 100 daily trips, you don't have to do a traffic study.
So they don't have to do one now. Right. So what about the 1? Okay.
100 daily trips would be like a 50.
10 lots.
10 lots.
10 lots. Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. That's what I was trying to get at.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll move on. The other two are pretty much the same issue. Now this gets more into the timing of concurrency. What we're saying here is that the concurrency begin once the development order, or rather the traffic impact study, and then subsequently the development order are approved, and then require the payment of impact fees within 6 months. And I think a related recommendation would be that their concurrency would not end until the issuance of all this. In other words, having no time limit on the concurrency. The rationale being, if you're asking for the impact fees to be paid, you're tracking COs, you require all projects that happen subsequent to any other projects to include their traffic onto a subsequent traffic study. Then, from our perspective, it makes sense to simply vest them indefinitely until they pull the COs. And as they pull the COs, the concurrency management system gets updated, because when the COs are issued, within some period of time, you reconcile that with the trips that are active in the concurrency management system. That's somewhat different from obviously what you're doing now, and also what you were doing prior to how I think you had a 1-year or 5-year concurrency approval prior to requiring it a building permit. In terms of your timing. The timing of the reservation.
Sure. Who's the expert here?
Chris.
Chris? Answer that one for us, Chris.
Or Bob.
Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, John is correct. Before the pending ordinance went into effect, we had 2 types of concurrency certificates. CCI ones that vest the concurrency for a year, and CCI 5, which you could get if you agreed not to get your impact fees back for non-commencement, and then the capacity be guaranteed for 5 years. Yes.
Next one? This is more of a housekeeping. I found it interesting. You guys include everything under the sun in your concurrency management database, with the exception of those subdivisions that were platted prior to 1990. So really, as a best practice, and I don't know how many units there are out there, or I should say subdivisions that were platted prior to, but just for completion, to go ahead and just include those projects into the database, so it's complete.
So then basically, I guess, Commissioner Davis, we're looking at Vero Lake Estates.
Vero Lake Estates, Sebastian Highlands. I would say Grosvenor Estates is probably platted before 1990.
Yeah.
I mean, since they are vested, you might as well put them in the system now and account for them. Well, they're approved as they come in. My understanding is you don't require a traffic study for those projects. Or if you do, they get, no matter what condition the roadways are in, they are approved.
That's because of de minimis, though, not because of capacity or vesting.
Well, I don't know if that's de minimis. To me is not what that really is. You have vested those projects because they were.
That's because we didn't start concurrency until 1990. Right. And anything prior to 1990, we looked at them. We didn't want to take their rights away. They didn't, people have bought those under a different rule. Now on the plat, there's a disclosure. But, it affects Vero Lake Estates, Sebastian Highlands, Oslo Park, Vero Tropical Gardens, Paradise Park, all those that are the older subdivisions. Those people who bought those lots weren't aware that concurrency was going to come. So what we have done is, however, in all the new plats, it shows that they may not have concurrency, anyone who buys it, and it's on when you purchase a property as a disclosure.
I don't think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think vesting is the proper term until they have paid their check for impact fees. It's called something. It should be called something else other than vesting.
Well, we almost got free vesting.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, vesting.
The only reason I call it vesting is because they can be approved. Even if every roadway they impact is over capacity, they will be approved, which to me is they're vested. Right. They have some right to build no matter what's going on around them.
Okay.
They're vested in that sense, but they're not vested in the impact.
Not vested in terms of having paid the impact fee. Right. I've had that problem before. I keep using the word vesting, and no, they haven't paid their impact fee. So I don't know of another term, what nomenclature would be appropriate for those parts, those exempt projects, if you will.
The point is that you want to make total complete number.
I'm sorry?
We don't have that number.
They're not accounted for in the database. Right. That's the only issue.
The point is that some of these subdivisions are very localized, and if there's a fair number of plots that have not been built on, if that information is not in the database, and then you look at another project coming in, you're not taking into account all the traffic that is already effectively in the system, because you haven't looked at those pre-1990 approvals. So the idea is to put that in your database. You are going to get your impact fees when they come in, but they have a right, no matter what the capacity situation is at that time, and just want to make sure that you don't have compounding the problem when you have new projects come in that affect those areas.
How about subdivisions and lots that currently exist and new subdivisions that are going to be built within the municipalities and coming online? And if you go around Sebastian and Vero Beach, there's probably hundreds and hundreds of vacant lots that are available, and also in Fellsmere, that's annexed about 3,700 acres. They're going to be putting in a whole subdivision up there that's going to have a great deal of effect on our roads. And I'm not sure how
we'll be counting those. It's the old subdivisions, and you have to be careful because you take Vero Lake Estates. We're counting already the existing houses that are there because they're on the roads and they'll come in our existing count. But you take a Vero Lake Estates platted in 1956. We're loading it on as if all those lots are built on. They're not. Sebastian Highlands. I think, my opinion, it should be like everything else. There's got to be an absorption rate there. Yeah. Because, it was platted in 1956. If you applied your theory, in 1970 we couldn't meet concurrency. We added all those on the two-lane roads we had in 1970. If you loaded them on. So I think that we may want to know about that and use it on our long-term planning and have a separate accounting subsidiary ledger
but I don't think we should count it for concurrency.
That's fine.
No, we've all been talking about two sets of
Subsidiary
books.
ledger. Subsidiary ledger. Is this two sets of books we're talking about now?
This is very much like doing a cash flow analysis on the same company, or a gap or accrual analysis.
Right.
It's the same figures. It's not a shell game. It's the same figures, except different factors are applied.
Right.
I think as these go online, and I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, Joe or Bob, with Vero Lake Estates, obviously as the house goes up, we're tracking that. It's just the houses that are vacant lots out there right now that we're not. Right?
That's exactly correct. They do need to come through the process. We actually look at fractional trip assignments when those houses in Vero Lake Estates come on. So there are a bunch of houses right now that are under construction right now, and those trips are vested in our system.
Well, we look at the numbers for planning purposes, not necessarily for concurrency.
No,
we need to, I think.
we are for concurrency. We are vesting the trips associated with the lots that come in for building permit, and we keep them in the database until they get a CO. Now, for planning purposes, we deal with that in a different way from concurrency. Concurrency is a regulatory process. Our planning goes on at the MPO, where we do travel demand forecasting models, and we look at our 154 traffic analysis zones, and we have all of the future year socioeconomic data in there, the number of dwelling units and the number of number of employees per employment category. So we actually do a lot of detailed long-range planning through the MPO using the travel demand forecasting model. We do our regulation through the concurrency process.
Is that what you keep updated monthly?
We keep the actually the concurrency database is updated every minute. When there's a building permit, when someone pays his impact fee, that database is updated. Chris updates it generally monthly with new counts. That's what there are two sides of that ledger. There's the capacity side and the demand side, and actually there are a couple of components of demand. There's the actual counts out there, and there are also the vested trips. The vested trips get updated on a real-time basis. The counts get updated generally monthly or when Chris does his counts.
And prior to all that, so really what we're trying to do is plan for what's in the pipeline and build roads based on modeling for future, kind of build our roads based some on concurrency needs and then others on what's in the pipeline. Right now, are we really counting what's in the pipeline?
We are counting them for the planning purposes, for the travel demand forecasting modeling, yes.
Bob, you have a question?
Yeah, I happen to agree with John. I think that we need to build in some anticipation factor into this pipeline. I mean, Sandra's point about having a seat for every kid, somehow we need to anticipate the traffic and have a seat for every car on the roads. And I don't know quite how you're going to do that from a transportation.
We could estimate it in advance, see what we had last year, and put that many in the system or something.
And certainly, I know you guys have seen this book that's put out by ITE, and probably the very first thing that it says in here is talking about anticipating pipeline development, and that's in their initial set of recommendations.
Whether we put it all in or not, I don't know. Don, do you have something?
Actually, I had a question for Mr. Keating.
He already sat down.
Sorry.
He's off the clock.
And only because I just want to clarify something in my own mind, which may be actually impossible sometimes. If we have 4,500 lots in Vero Lake Estates, and let's say 2,000 of them are built on now, are those 2,000 considered vested and they're in our counts?
They are actually counted. When Chris goes out and does counts on County Road 512 or 510, those actually show up as counted. Okay. Now, vested are trips that are not yet on the road. we project them being on the road as soon as the house is CO'd. They're in that limbo category between a building permit having been issued or a concurrency certificate issued and a CO. They're vested.
So let's say today Chris went out and did a traffic study. All those homes there that are already built that have cars on the road are now counted as of today when he does a traffic study. Let's say tomorrow I pull a building permit. If the traffic is, if it's over the limit, we have no concurrency left, we can't put a car on the road. If I pull a building permit because I'm de minimis, I still get my building permit.
Yeah.
That's what you mean by de minimis in Vero Lake Estates.
Yes, there is one caveat in state law saying that the de minimis allowance can't be applied to hurricane evacuation routes. So that is a safeguard there. So if you've got a hurricane evacuation route that's already over capacity, you can't approve de minimis projects impacting that link.
Based on,
That's every
2 years ago, every state highway in the South Florida is over capacity.
Well, the state doesn't have to reach concurrency. That's the interesting thing. They put the rules enough, but not on themselves. But I think that's why we talk about an absorption factor. Maybe we should account for and say that, you know, there's so many lots left, and we think that they'll be used up in 10 years. So we look historically at those subdivisions and see what they've done in the last 5 years and say we'll apply those as a factor to our model rather than loading them on, because I also think that's an unrealistic way to look at it.
One other thing I wanted to hit on before we kept going with this is we do account for them in background growth rates already with the studies that come in. When a study comes in for County Road 510 or 512, they're required to look at the last 4 or 5 years and project out to wherever their build-out date is a background growth rate. And that background growth rate is going to reflect the additional lots that are being built year to year in Vero Lake Estates. So in that instance, we are covering historical growth in Vero Lake Estates or any other subdivision that could be de minimis or platted prior to 1990.
How's there such a discrepancy then between this screen and what we do, Chris? Obviously prior to 1990.
Well, I think what John is saying is that he wants the entire number of lots that are exempt somehow represented in the system. And what we're assuming is in 1956 we wouldn't have done that. Otherwise, in 1956 we would have shown a need for a 4-lane road on 510, and that's not reasonable.
And I think if we showed every single plotted piece of property, I think all our roads would be way over capacity.
Yes, they would. That's why we're thinking more in terms of an absorption rate or a rate that these lots are going to develop over time would be a more logical, orderly way to do it.
So you took Collier County, for example, and compared us to them. They're Golden Gate Estates, a GDC development, very similar to Sebastian Highlands, Vero Highlands, but huge, sat vacant forever. And you're telling me that Collier County has those vested and has all those trips in Golden Gate Estates on there?
I don't remember saying that. I can check real quick. There are actually some of these counties that don't even track their approved projects, if you can believe that. So,
okay.
I don't want you guys to get this feeling like, I mean, you guys have a phenomenal database. This for me was just more of a housekeeping issue.
Okay,
I mean,
all right.
Frankly, you guys, honestly, I mean, in my experience, you're tracking just about every single thing you can, with the only exception of these platted lots prior to 1990 that when I hear that they're exempt, that's the only distinction I'm making here. Because they're exempt and can just come in and get their concurrency regardless of the state of the road that they're impacting, my position, if I put my public sector hat on, is that I want those trips in there. If it makes roads go over capacity, then I'm that much more ahead of the game. You guys are well ahead of the game. I'm getting you that extra, I guess, 1%, if you will, to account for everything. Now, there's nothing wrong with treating them like vested projects, which is what they do in Miami-Dade County. In Miami-Dade County, they actually will grant a vested rights order. They will issue vested rights on a property. They don't want to put them active into the concurrency system. They
Even
will
some of
simply
the old-
approve it when it comes.
The old subdivisions that are just slowly growing,
Yeah.
like ours, do other people vest them when they're all there?
I think no, they probably don't.
I think there's a
But I'm-
balance. The new subdivisions coming in, we count them up front.
Sure.
The subdivisions that are currently here, we count them after the fact. But they're still counted, they're still added into the system, but not until they're built on. So I think there's a compromise there. And periodically when we update, we catch them up, but we catch those individual
When they come in
houses
for
up
permits, sure.
as they're built.
Well, also,
I agree with that.
But also the background traffic we add. We call it the background traffic factor we add. So we also try and build it's almost like an absorption factor. There's background traffic.
I get my question here, John, is probably more towards P&Z because they're sitting here, and I know as I watch the P&Z meetings, it's always a shotgun at Chris with traffic and traffic counts. Is this where you guys are getting with George as far as those trips?
No, I don't think we're addressing the issue that we've had a lot of debate over, this is dealing with concurrency.
Right.
Our issue's been more dealing with planning.
Okay.
And let me, you want me to get into it, Tom?
Chairman, I think it's good time, but-
I'd love to see you get into it, Tom.
I think the issue that we've had occurs when you have a new development and it does a traffic study. And as I understand it, the purpose of the traffic study is to identify the potential impacts that the new development will have on the road system. And in that analysis, for planning purposes, the question is whether you should include previously approved projects that have not yet vested in determining the impact on the roads and the availability of capacity on those roads. And the way you have written this recommendation, you're dealing only, I think, with concurrency and dealing with the prior 1990 projects. And so the question that I would ask is to focus the issue, Tom. In doing a traffic analysis for a new development and in calculating the impact on the roads, how is the traffic study to handle previously approved projects which have not yet vested?
Yeah, and I think I'm getting into trouble here with using the word vesting. My understanding of vesting is more in terms of vested rights. I discussed this with staff at some length, and I guess the issue that I'm hearing is that you've got a number of projects in the pipeline, so to speak, that haven't yet gotten there. I mean, notwithstanding the building permit timing, but when you have projects that are in the system but have not been quote unquote approved, which you refer to as vested. So the problem is you have a number of projects that are in the pipeline that are not being accounted for. Now, as I understood it from Chris, I believe, you are requiring new impact studies to apply a growth rate, so to speak, to account for those projects in the pipeline.
An absorption rate.
Right. But what happens, for example, and I'll use Dade County as the best example, who I think addresses this. What happens is you're issued what's referred to as a tentative or an intermediate development order, if you will, which gives you a 1-year reservation of concurrency so that it is accounted for in the database system. But it's understood that you can't pull any permits yet because you're still trucking through the system. And there are certain criteria in between. I think every 3 months you have to come back and make it active. Even though it's given for a year, they make sure you're on the ball, not just coming in for a year and walking away. They make sure you're diligent on it. The idea being that at some point you have to establish a time when they have some sort of a tentative or provisional approval of concurrency, okay, which is not a final development order, but more in terms of an intermediate one, so that you account for these. I presume because it's such an issue, I presume it's quite a few projects. So that was my recommendation to staff in the discussion. It's not here in this document, but I mean, there is a way to do it. Of course, it means more work on the part of staff, because now you're going to have to whereas you would know exactly where it comes out of the database, which is when made active in your concurrency management database, is when their impact fees are paid. What I'm saying is before, and you guys treat it more like a commodity. I'm not giving you 1 ounce of concurrency until you fork over something.
Right.
But in my opinion, to address this issue that I'm hearing, if I'm hearing it correctly, these projects that are in the approval process but haven't gotten their DO yet should be identified in the concurrency management database. In my humble opinion, as an intermediate, I mean, they should still take concurrency from, or become active in the system, and then they become final when they get their development order approved and they pay their impact fees. I don't know if that addresses it sufficiently.
That's a good word to apply as something like intermediate or pending or something like that.
A reservation.
But
They call them initial development orders
Yeah.
for public hearings, things of that nature,
Well,
which aren't getting
but you-
any sort of approval. Intermediate for things that are being platted, and then your final development orders are those that are more binding, building permits, site plan approval, those sorts of things.
because the word
That system.
commodity is a good word on these things, because we got in trouble, sold out the whole road to a subdivision which today is still sitting out there as dirt. So, yes.
I'd like to read from this ITE recommended practice book. The title is Transportation Impact Analyses. And in their first chapter, under the chapter's title is Purpose and Overview. On the review process, under objectives, the local agency review process should encourage and ensure the following. I'm not going to read a few of them, but here's one very important one. A realistic awareness of other developments under construction, pending, approved, anticipated, or allowed.
Yeah.
Couldn't be better said.
Right.
So is the debate then what is realistic? Because it sounds like that we do some of that with and I'm going to twist more with this, it sounds like we do some of that with the Bureau of Lake Estates. We anticipate how many units are going to come online. But now, does that mean that in that same area and same corridor, does that also mean that we're considering Blue Water Bay, which is right across the street from it, or is that taken totally off, or are we assuming that is
And that's the
development?
point. Blue Water Bay needs to be cognizant of Bureau Lake Estates and vice versa. And certainly, if you look at the South County initiative, those all need to be cognizant of each other. I mean, if they all came online at the same time, it would kill us.
Yeah, but Blue Water Bay and those type subdivisions would be online fairly quickly, within a couple of years, 3 years. Bureau Lake Estates, who's to say? It might be 10 years, 20 years.
And, in Bureau Lake Estates, we use that as a batting ball, but, it is coming online right now.
But not as fast as these other brand new subdivisions.
This is true.
Well, I mean, if we kept up the pace that we had for the past 2 years, in 4 years, it'd be built out.
Bureau Lake Estates?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman,
Possibility.
Bureau of Lake
But
Estates.
it's not going to do that. I'm just saying if it kept it up.
It could.
Bureau Lake Estates, Mr. Baird suggested a phase-in, a trend line, which makes a lot of sense. But what we still haven't joined the issue is on approved projects, forget Bureau Lake Estates. Let's talk about a project that was approved 6 months ago
South County.
and is actively going forward. And the question is whether you can rely on a background growth rate or you have to build in the project numbers and for planning purposes. And for example, Collier County, according to the summary, says you either add the approved projects or you use the background growth rate, whichever is higher. And Palm Beach says you take the roadway growth rate or 1% growth rate plus the approved projects. So I think the question the consultants seem to be, I'm not sure they're directly answering it, is the growth rate to be used, or or the approved project numbers, or a combination of the two in determining the impact that a new project's going to have on the roadway system.
Or even better yet, which one of those or which hybrid of those are we doing now?
Now we're doing only the growth rate. There's nothing else being done.
Bob's shaking his head.
No, what we do is any amount of land use that is approved for development, which means vested, they cannot pull a building permit till they're vested and pay their impact fees. So it is not reflected on our system until that occurs. Let's go back. Back in 1990 or 1991, when we first established concurrency, the way we did it was the recommendation here. When a project came in, a subdivision or a site plan, the applicant had to pay all his impact fees up front. He was vested at approval. And then there's no question. Everything's covered. It's reflected in the database. What happened was it was a downturn in the economy. The housing market slumped, and the rules were changed, and we allowed developers to take risks. And that was the system until the pending ordinance came. Developers could take risk and get a preliminary plat, a subdivision, approved, but not vested. They could take the risk and wait until building permit to actually pay their impact fees and vest. And that's the way we've been. Staff is right now working on changes, recommended changes, an LDR change to Chapter 910 as to when the, to require vesting earlier in the process, to not allow applicants to take the risk and wait until building permit time, but have to vest at final plat approval as the latest time frame.
I'm not sure I agree with that. And ideally, I'd like to go to the system that nobody vests until they absolutely have to. To me, that would mean that as a commission, we have solved the transportation scarcity issue in this county. And the reason we're here right now is because we have a perceived scarcity of concurrency. But if you take, I mean, regardless of what the economy did in 1990, there is subdivisions that are on the books right now that, in my opinion, it's not wise to have all of those lots 100% vested, because they're vacant right now, and it's putting ghost trips on our system and giving us almost a false reading. But yet, if they pull a building permit like we're doing it right now, it is real. And not only that is it real, it's also 6, 9 months, quite possibly even a year, depending on how long it takes to construct the house, gives us the opportunity to do some proper planning, to building. Proper building planning needs to be done before that. But that'll give us the opportunity to do proper building.
Do it at time frame.
We're going to have to take a break in another 10 or 15 minutes. John, are you about done with your presentation? Or?
I got it.
Suppose you get all the way through your presentation, and then we'll take our little break we need to, and we can come back.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, if you'll allow me just a second, I'll try to be very quick. But I want to emphasize a point that John made earlier about your system. I was at a seminar in Fort Myers a couple weeks ago where the Department of Community Affairs came down and did, on the Fair Share Model Ordinance, and they used Indian River County as a model of having an excellent database in terms of traffic concurrency. So John said you guys are doing a great job, and you are. We're just pointing out some areas that you've asked us to look at it. We're trying to make sure that we do it fairly and give you guys a full and complete analysis.
We've been tweaking it, but it's still got some glitches in it. Why don't you go ahead through the rest? I think there's 4 or 5 more pages.
I'll try to be
and then we'll come back for some discussion.
Okay. Our recommendation here is for COs to be posted once a year, and what I mean by that is that apparently, presently, what happens is, as Mr. Keating mentioned, you're pretty much updating the system almost on a daily basis. Okay. Most counties actually implement their counts at a date certain, and at that date certain, also reconcile all their COs, so they're not constantly chasing. Because what happens with a CO is, if I have a CO for a 10,000 square foot office building, and with your 5 peak hour directional, I'm impacting maybe 20, 30 roads. Well, before I can reconcile that CO and make it inactive in your concurrency database, I have to make sure that every roadway was counted after the issuance of the CO. Okay? So this is more of a mechanism to sort of, it's going to make it much more conservative and less real time, because you'll be doing it once a year. Okay, and that may be something you don't like, but it makes it much easier to reconcile COs rather than having staff just constantly do it on a daily basis. So this is more of trying to, I guess, make it simpler, but maybe, well, I don't know how you would say less or more conservative, but...
Tie it with the traffic counts, they both do it.
Yeah, and then the next recommendation talks about, I don't know in your database if it's it didn't sound like an easy task to reconcile a CO. Confirming that a count was performed at a date certain. Recommendation here is to maybe come up with something in the database that can be done through software or programming so that you can reconcile a CO quicker rather than having to manually verify the date of a traffic count, if you will. And again, with a CO, you could be talking about anywhere from 10 to 35 roads, or counts, I should say. My understanding is that now Indian River County inputs updated traffic counts on a monthly basis. Our recommendation, frankly, is like every other county, where it's typically, they get posted for 1 year and they're good for 1 year. So right now it seems like it's just you're counting constantly throughout the year and putting them in on a monthly basis. Traffic count, this has to do with, in terms of when you do a traffic study, how current does the count have to be? We recommend a year. I think your policy right now is 6 months. The count has to be within 6 months of the date of your methodology. We're saying let it be a year. Again, that's the same issue in terms of traffic counts. Sorry, that's the same issue with respect to methodology, having the count. Well, this is sort of in contrast. Having the count that was active during the time of the methodology meetings, what should be allowable, we think there should be a year maximum to that. Not just let somebody keep, messing around with a traffic study for more than a year and be expected to use the old data, if you will. Again, this is more of a flexibility issue. I don't know if staff is that crazy about it, but, you have your minimum thresholds in your code, but you could have certain extenuating circumstances. If you know that a road is heavily traveled and it would be a benefit to have maybe an exclusive right turn lane, then I would like to have staff to have that flexibility to require it, even if it doesn't meet your minimum thresholds. You're stacking right now for residential, I believe, I want to say is a minimum of 70 feet, and that's pretty much all that's stipulated in the code. What I'm recommending is that you require queuing analysis, or stipulate in the code that a queuing analysis would be required. Probably specify some methodology in particular so that you're not stuck with just a 70-foot minimum. This is just one technicality in the code where you don't specify that you're measuring the stacking distance from the first point of contact as opposed to from the gate. So that's just a clarification for the code. And that's it, in a nutshell.
Okay. I think before we open it up to discussion, we will take that little break. Do you have all of this in a little matrix listed, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? So we know what these are? Do we have copies of that?
I'm sorry,
a list of all these recommendations, simply put.
They should be in the study, and they are bulleted in the same manner.
Last page.
Is this a conclusion?
It's in the traffic study, it's the first 9 pages is the executive summary.
The executive summary, that's back there.
Yes.
I got to get it. Okay. Look, let's take us a quick break, and we'll come back and we'll continue the discussion. Can we take our seats, please? I hear an echo.
Judge Judy.
The next break we take will be for dinner about 7 o'clock. And
He's buying.
Commissioner Wheeler is buying.
okay, before we open the discussion, I'll turn it back to John Kim if he wants to reference anything we found in the matrix too. Donna found there's a matrix showing all of the suggestions. She went to make copies of it. That's in the big report. But I did find my copy of the executive summary. So if you want to wrap it up, or are you wrapped up?
I just want to address the issue that the gentleman here is bringing up. I'm understanding now where he's coming from. Part of this recommendation, or the intention of part of this recommendation was maybe contrary to treating this as a commodity issue, as you have. We believe that the concurrency database should include a project when A, the traffic study is approved and deemed correct, and second, when the development order is issued. Okay? Now, if you remember correctly, and I have it up on the screen here, we said allow impact fees to be paid within 6 months. Now, if they don't pay those impact fees within 6 months of that development order approval, then they lose all their vesting and they go back to the beginning of the process. The gentleman next to me is telling me that concurrency is not accounted for in the database system until the impact fee is paid, which can be at the, I guess, at the discretion of the applicant. Correct? Or a building, or rather a building permit. Now,
What used to be at the discretion of the applicant.
okay, well, what I'm proposing is something not in line with that. What I'm saying is, for a concurrency management system to be just that, okay, when you issue a final development order on a piece of property, it should be accounted for in the concurrency database. Now, you may find that that's counting ghost trips, and we don't know when they're going to be, and maybe to address that, you want to put a date certain on the concurrency approval, in contrast to what I am recommending, which is to simply let them exist in perpetuity until the COs erase all the reservation in the system. But clearly, a concurrency management database should account for projects that have final development orders issued, with or without the payment of impact fee. If you were going to require the payment of impact fee, in my humble opinion, then you should make it a requirement, although I don't know how the industry would react. But you clearly have, there is a disconnect here where you simply, in my opinion, must account for all development order approvals, final development order approvals, whether or not they paid the impact fee or not.
See that?
My humble opinion, sir.
Oh, no. I could go either way. I'm trying. I think that probably to slow growth down, that would be the way to go. But I don't think it would be fair. And the problem I have setting up here and going all beyond all the technical stuff are there's a lot of people in the building industry. And the big international and national companies come in here, and now you've turned that impact fee into a commodity to some degree, and they can come in here and buy 1,000 units and not build them for 15 years, as long as they're moving forward, and the little guy that wants to build 10, 15, 20, 30 units is just pushed right out of the picture. And it's, it's Walmart and the building industry taking over.
I am somewhat liberated from that because I don't have, it's easy for me to sit here as a traffic engineer and simply make that statement and walk away. Now, I had to deal with developers, attorneys, and whatnots during my tenure with Miami-Dade County. I don't mean to say that it's easy. And in Dade County, frankly, it got to a point where it was basically not even pay-as-you-go. Just come into a vested rights hearing, and it's a given that you're going to get. And I watched applicant after applicant get vested rights with no real basis whatsoever. So that simply is a decision you have to make. From my perspective as a transportation engineer, and again, wearing my public sector hat versus my private sector hat, I would say that I would want to make sure that the concurrency management system is letting me know when things will fail. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what have you. Yeah. So that is, again, the humblest opinion I can give you, without having to be in a position such as yours.
Well, and I look at this like in a whole different way. And I'm obviously not a planner, and this also isn't an exact science no matter how you slice it.
Absolutely.
I look at it as, I drew a little chart here for one for planning, one for concurrency. And under planning, I have approved subdivisions. Let's say 20, 30,000 homes in approved subdivisions. And then I've got over here maybe 2,000 homes a year that are being built that have paid their impact fees. So that's what the impact is annually. It might be 2,000 homes a year versus the 20 or 30,000 been approved. Somewhere is in between there for planning and to build our roads and to try and stay ahead of it. I think we need to massage those numbers for the planning to build the roads without actually moving it all over to concurrency where you shut projects down and put some guys out of business.
And then I guess my question is, it sounds like we're doing something similar to that, but there's still some disconnect there from what I'm hearing from P&Z.
Only because I think they're applying a growth rate, if you will, to account some percentage applied to existing traffic volumes to account for that basically unknown or not definitive quantity in terms of impacts of other projects that are in the system but haven't pulled their building permits yet.
You know, before the pending ordinance, we did count them at land development permit.
Yeah.
We did count them, so we did. And then to make up for the existing lots, we had the background, what we call the background analysis. So we were doing that. And you are a traffic engineer.
I think we counted them then.
And the one thing you are forgetting is my capital plan. I want my money then if I'm going to account for it so that I can build the roads. They don't happen overnight. But we did, prior to the pending ordinance, we did do it at, when did we do it, Bob? Because that moved it up. We didn't have the vesting, the 5-year and
We did. Before the pending ordinance, we had the 1 year and 5 year, and someone could come in at any time. It could be before a land development permit. It could be a preliminary plat, or it could be just if he had a 20-acre parcel and wanted to vest a certain amount of land use on it. So we were really liberal back then as to who can vest, and if someone vested, those trips were put on there, put in the database, and assigned to all the roadways.
George, you have something?
Thank you, Art. The only thing, the concern I had, and we've banded this back and forth at P&Z a lot, and I think, frankly, this is kind of the essence of the concern. I mean, he's been very complimentary of the database, how we figure. There's very little in all of his other recommendations that that do not actually say how well we look at the numbers, which is good to know because we're conservative in what we do. The real question, though, is that every time we start adding trips and worrying about concurrency in Gary, it's either people want to slow growth down, or I'm not sure if we're looking at it for planning purposes in any other way, but we worry about either changing levels of service because we've got to maintain concurrency, or we worry about changing these numbers because we're going to mess up the building, finishing our backlog and our pipeline. Whatever we do, and I think that what George has always had a valid point about from a planning standpoint, I think it's good to know the numbers, but I think if you're going to say yes or no, you cannot build, you have to have a very definitive line, more so than potential building. But if we're going to move toward potential building and what our consultant is saying, then I think we need to make sure we have allow for I'll say grandfathering, a period of time, so we don't just close the door overnight by changing the numbers in what we're doing, which doesn't stop what the industry is, building industry overall. We've got to allow a wide enough time for the new numbers to take effect, to give us a chance to absorb some of what we have and keep moving. I don't think we can just stop if we add all of these numbers in tomorrow.
And you're talking about implementing the process, but right now I don't know what the process is.
We're not going back.
You understand? I mean, it's a good point. I understand what you're saying, but what is going to be that hybrid that Commissioner Wheeler mentioned? The absorption rate is this, the pipeline is this. So what do we plan for? And that's what I don't know. I don't know what to do. Anybody pipe up?
George Christopher?
Well, why don't you get the facts and then decide how to implement? This is not a slow growth proposition. This is a planning proposition. Put the numbers into the database. and then decide how to implement them. We don't know now whether we're on schedule in building roads, 5 years behind, 10 years behind, 15 years behind.
Or ahead.
Why don't we get the numbers, put them into the database, and then see what that facts often shed light on matters in a way that's very good.
Well, the idea is, how do you get the numbers?
Right.
Do you get them at building permit? Do you get them at development order? Do you get them at the de minimis guys? Or that's what we're trying to arrive at here. Get this all together, get our arms around it, and see which fits best.
Well, we do have the facts. We know how many lots are built on in all these subdivisions. We know what all the lots that are available. We do have those facts. What we need to do is, what's a fair way to apply that? If you load it all on, that gives you misinformation, as if all those trips are on the road today.
And we don't
That's why I'm saying we do an absorption rate for that. Staff feels also, we've discussed it, the time for impact fee of land development permit rather than building. That gives us more time to plan. That gives us more time to get roads out. And the payment should be there. I mean, if you want us to do roads in a timely fashion, one of the key things is have the money available. But we have that information. The thing is, we know how many COs we've got in that subdivision, how many lots are left on all the existing subdivisions. You don't think so?
Joe, you don't have the information except by way of background growth numbers. The only numbers you have are where there's been actual vesting. And you're getting, forget Indian Bureau Lake Estates, forget that. That's not the issue. The issue is the projects that have been approved and have not yet vested. You don't have those in your system unless they've been vested. And we're talking about planning. We're not talking about concurrence, at least I'm not.
If I may, just to clarify, and I think this is an important point. I asked the other 5 counties the question, when does concurrency begin and when is it put into the concurrency database? Okay? Indian River at the time of the building permit. Collier begins and put into the database when 50% of the impact fees are paid and when a certificate of adequacy has been issued, which is basically a development order. Martin County begins at final site plan approval, which again would be the issuance of a development order. Miami-Dade County begins with a plat or building permit approval, more often a plat, which is again a tentative development order, which ultimately becomes a final development order once it's approved by the Board of County Commissioners. Sarasota County, issuance of a construction authorization approval, which again would occur subsequent to a development order approval. And finally, Palm Beach County begins when the project gains site plan approval, which again would be a development order. So your other counties are doing it basically at the time of either the land development permit or at the time that the development order is issued.
That's pretty good.
That's an important point.
Then you use up your concurrency way ahead of when it's actually needed.
Well, that's one way to look at it, but if you're managing, the concurrency is referred to as a concurrency management system, you are trying to determine when roadways fail. Okay? That's the point. The point is not to stop or help development. The point is, when will these roads stop being able to carry capacity? So you're looking at it from a much different perspective than I have to right now because of where I'm sitting. I understand the issue, but
staff agrees with the land development permit. I can tell you that we've discussed it, and Bob will get up. We have discussed it. That's what we agreed.
Bob will get up.
Let me tell you, the fallacy with, or actually that suggestion is fine as long as impact fees are paid. But if impact fees are paid, you're putting demand, all kinds of demand on the system, and you're not getting the resources to create the supply.
Right.
To me, it's absolutely ridiculous. What some of these other counties are doing is they're not counting those trips all the way through the system. I think we have a real good database, and we implement that diligently. And any time a trip is vested, it's there until it's CO'd, and then it's taken off the system. Actually, if you don't do things the way we do it, which is we deal with fractional trips. If you have a 100-lot subdivision, we're looking at each separate house taking fractions of the trips that the big project assigns to all the roads. And that way we can incrementally keep the database updated as each one of those houses gets CO'd. But I think the big thing is, and Joe mentioned this before, You can't expect the roadways to be built, the capacity to be there, if you're loading all kinds of trips on the system and you're not getting the impact fees at that time.
So they're loading them on the system in these other counties. When did they pay their impact fees?
That was my next point I was going to make. Again, asking the 5 counties in question. Collier requires the payment of 50% of the impact fees.
When?
Development order.
At the development order, so that they can reserve concurrency. The question was asked, do impact fees have to be paid prior to the issuance of a concurrency reservation?
Okay, real quick, when you say impact fees, 50%, you're just talking traffic impact fees. You're not talking about water, sewer, school.
In the case of Collier, I believe it's transportation, or roadway rather. In Martin County, roadway and school impact fees must be paid within 60 days of the final site plan approval. The other 3 counties, Miami-Dade, Sarasota, and Palm Beach, do not require the payment of impact fees until the building permits.
That's what we're doing.
Correct, but they also account for the concurrency when the development order is issued. They don't wait until the building permit. So they are accounted for in the concurrency database.
And that's crazy to me.
Yeah.
Bruce, you have something?
I've got to run, but I wanted to say 2 things. One, Leslie, just because they required a building permit doesn't mean they don't permit it before that. See, you don't permit it before that, so don't get confused. What you just said is inaccurate.
Right.
But what Joe said is correct. The staff will support that you should allow people to pay their impact fees at land development permit. You should at least allow them to do that. But what I disagree with Joe about is that you have to pay them all at once. He says you can't plan for your transportation unless you get all the money up front, but I don't think that's, in my opinion, that's not necessarily true. If you did like what this gentleman said, if you paid half up front, see, Bob's got a good system. Once you've paid, you're going to use those trips. But what Mr. Christopher is suggesting is just because you've planned a project, that doesn't mean you're going to use the trips. We know of projects around here that have been approved that have never been built. And so to say that you have to build your roads because those projects have been approved, even though they haven't paid their impact fees, is going to lead to a bad result. But if you make them pay their impact fees, or at least bond them out at a time certain, then you know their money's on the line. They're going to build their project. So I want to agree with Joe that at least at the time of land development permit, you should be permitted to pay your impact fees or bond them out or pay half of them, and that way you know the money's on the line, the project is going to be built. Before that, you really don't know that.
But the cars aren't on the road.
That's correct. That's right.
And they won't be on the road till when? Months?
Well, once you pay your money, those cars are going to be on the road pretty quick. Because once somebody puts down $8 million for an impact fee for a large project, they're going to be starting to build those houses.
Unless concurrency getting short.
Pardon me?
Unless concurrency is getting short.
But what you're proposing doesn't stop that.
You're right.
Yeah. So, anyway.
Thanks, Mr. Barquette. Any other comments from the audience while we have a little B&Z guys? There's Bob Swift.
Thank you. I'll be brief because I know you guys have already had a long day. I'm Bob Swift, 6450 Glendale. I hear a lot of elements that answer bits and pieces of the question. Commissioner Wheeler and Commissioner Davis are both saying very similar things. We don't want to break the system. We don't want to completely put a stop to the economic engine that construction and development are for this county. Bob and his staff need an equitable way or a reasonable way of planning for the future and having some predictability of when the needs are going to occur. When are these cars really going to start coming on the road? Joe needs to know when he's going to get the money, the plan for that occurrence. I'm kind of a simple-minded guy. When I plan a project, one of the things I have to do for my cash flow analysis is assume over the life of that project, when am I going to build, when am I going to need the money, when am I going to get the money back in? So I do a 3-5 year build out depending on the size of the project, and I make my forecast accordingly. What I would suggest is that a similar system be used for managing the concurrency process and the planning, because it would give Mr. Christopher and the Planning Commission some assurity that I've got 500 projects planned, 500 units planned, and I'm telling the county they can expect there are going to be 100 units a year for the next 5 years coming into the system. If all of the projects were done that way, then the county would have a database really showing what the true growth is going to be or projected to be, depending on the market, from those developments, added to the background traffic from out-of-county traffic and those lots that are not in the system. Couple that with a surety bond or a letter of credit so that the county knows that when those units come online, even if they don't come online, you're going to get paid for it. It relieves the burden of the landowner, especially the smaller landowner up front, from having to pay a huge amount of money for assets that he's not going to be able to use for several years down the road. But it also gives the county the assurance that when we step up to the plate and say, I'm going to pull the building permit, that the money is going to be there to pay for those impact fees. Now, Joe would rather have the money up front, and I can appreciate that. I'd rather have the money up front to put into other elements of the community project. Somewhere in between, there ought to be a balance. But to load what now is amounting close to $20,000 a unit all up front in order to have the predictability down the way that you're going to have the ability to pull the building permit is an onerous burden. And for some people, it's just going to be too much of a burden. It's similar to, it's a simple-minded analogy would be reserving a table at a restaurant. You reserve the table, they know you're going to be coming in at a given time. You give them a credit card number. If you don't show up, you get charged anyway. But you're not charged until you get there.
Yeah, but when you eat your meal, they don't tell you to pay in 6 months. It's
You can pay it in 6 months.
I think you can do it in phases, you know.
Bring your espresso,
or they don't say put a surety bond up.
That wasn't fair.
But I think that you could do your project in phases.
We could do it, and we're not that far off, Joe. What I'm trying to figure out is how we can both have predictability. That when I'm ready to do phase 3, that concurrency is going to be available, and you know that I'm going to do phase 3, or if not, you're going to get paid for it anyway. That's all I'm suggesting.
May I ask Mr. Swift some questions?
Up to the chairman.
Yes, you may.
I would like to see us try and find some way to make something like what Mr. Swift is talking about work, without bonding, letter of credits. Okay, we've been through that. But if he comes in with a project and he has 500 units, and we put 100 of those units on the vested list right away and get the money up front for those 100 units, and we have reserved 400 units, and he's going to pay for 100 the year after, 100 the year after, until he's got his 500 units done. He's not allowed to have any more building permits than 100 per year. Right. He's paid already on those 100. His reservation for next year gets paid at the beginning of the year when he gets his approval to build those 100 units. We've got him counted on the books. We've got the money for the ones that he's going to do this year. We've got a letter of credit for the other 400. How can we make this a win-win for everybody and come up with some kind of a solution to the problem?
You can do it in phases. That's similar to do it in phases. You've seen Grand Harbor did it in phases. DeVos is doing it in phases, and we account for them, and it's a more reasonable way, I think, to do it.
I think that's an excellent idea. So we do it in phases. He comes in with a 5-phase project. Does he have to have all his infrastructure done for the entire project, right?
Or an LDP.
I'll have Bob answer that correctly. I'll probably want to answer it totally. Bob, Keating, can you?
Well, as far as the phases go, though, if he doesn't pay, if he's only paying for 100 at a time, his other 400 aren't guaranteed when he comes in the next year.
That's all I'm asking
and that's
for.
Fair.
Predictability.
Well, he is asking for predictability on the other 400, though, and how do we give that to them and us make sure we get our money, too?
You know what I'm amazed at? The attorneys came in when we went to building permit, and they said, you're denying my client the right. They want to pay them all right now. Now we're giving them the right. And he said, no, we don't want to pay them right now. I'm confused. Same attorneys are arguing the other side.
And Joe,
360 has done.
What did you get at break time?
Since I filed the lawsuits, and I know Will's going to remind you all about that because he does that. My name is Brian Seymour with the law firm of Gunster Oakley. We represent several clients who have property here in Indian River County. And the answer, Joe, isn't you didn't let us pay. Or the answer is you didn't let us make the decision. And I think what Bob is saying is let us make some decisions as we go forward. For our clients, we weren't saying necessarily we want to pay because frankly, our clients would rather have, I think, Bob's option, but they were saying we would rather pay than get nothing. And that's what the lawsuits were about, is they're getting nothing. And they'd rather at least pay than get nothing. But I think at the end of the day, a phased letter of credit or a surety bond that at times certain is tied to the capital improvements plan. And I think that's the way to do it. If you tie it to the capital improvements plan, you know when your projects are coming and how much money you're going to need, maybe that's the way to do it. That being said, maybe I don't know that that's something we all have to decide the specifics of today. But to maybe try to formulate something when there's ordinance drafting going on as to how to deal with that issue. But as to the lawsuits, there was a different issue, Joe. So it wasn't, please make us pay. It was give us an option.
We're willing to bring you a check today and pay. I thought I heard that. I might not have.
We would. If we could vest, we would certainly do that. And we've tried to do that. We weren't allowed to, but we did try. And if that's what the commission finally decides, that it's a payment, our clients would try to find the money and they'd come in and pay. But the problem with the pending ordinance issue wasn't that we want to pay. It's that we don't have any choice now. We can't do anything, and we can't get to the point where we're even going to be able to pay. And it's a little bit confusing, admittedly, and we had some lengthy discussion yesterday with Judge Hawley about it. But that was the issue. So it's a different subset. And we would agree with what Bob was proposing. We think that's a fair way to do it. If you make us pay, we'll find a way to pay. But I don't know that everybody can do that.
Mr. Chairman.
And that's for the grand scheme. This may be a fair way to deal with everybody. That's all we're saying.
Mr. Wheeler?
Yeah, I want to make sure I understand clearly what Bob's proposing, because I think as far as it goes, it makes sense. But the other side of that coin is you're coming in with a 500 home project. So in actuality, you give 20% of the impact fees up front to pay for 100, but to reserve 500. And trying to be fair, maybe I'm wrong here, but trying to be fair, I mean, we're running into that situation now with what happened on South 27th Avenue, where they bought up all the capacity on the road, and the houses might not be built for 5 or 6 years under our old system. So you're coming in, you're going to give us 20% of the total impact of 500 homes over a 5-year period, reserve your capacity for the next 5 years, and then we got to wait year by year by year to see whether you're going to complete it or not complete it, and somebody else is pushed out of the picture. Am I understanding that wrong?
Well, I may not have explained it thoroughly, and again, this is, we're kind of thinking out loud here. But I am saying that if you allow the phasing of the impact fees, that the county should get with that a guarantee, regardless. Irrevocable letter of credit, surety bond from a company approved by your staff, that you're going to get paid on a time certain for those remaining impact fees. So part of your concern, let me say, I'm not suggesting that I'm asking the county to take a risk of whether or not they get paid. I'm saying no. There would have to be an assurance that you're going to get paid and paid on the time certain.
So you're saying if you have a letter of credit or a bond or something, so say in 3 years you got 200 units left and you go bankrupt, we'd still get the impact fees for what was reserved.
Exactly. If that irrevocable letter of credit is there with assuming the bank's still in business, or the insurance company is still in business if it's a bond.
When Grand Harbor went bankrupt, we had a letter of credit. I exercised that 24 hours before they went bankrupt. If I hadn't, I wouldn't have had a job. And believe me, that developer tried everything to stop it. So let's say they go bankrupt before we exercise that letter of credit. I'm not too sure you have everything, because the bank went bankrupt in that case.
Oh, yeah. All the rules
and
changed.
all the rules changed.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to, limit the county's exposure, but we can expose each other. We can expose you to whatever you want.
No, thank you.
But I just, you go first.
You go first, Joe.
I don't think I will. But what I'm trying to do is, we're trying to we have a capital plan. The other thing that can happen on the other side of this coin, if I don't have the money to meet all my capital plan, and I don't meet my level of services, they could get hit on the other end. And I just believe that they should put their money up. We hear about from the public the roads. We're trying to get the roads done. It helps. We may be flush with cash today. I have to write a $46 million check to the state to open up 60. I predict by next year my road fund, I'll be down to 20% of what it is today, and the following year we may be borrowing money.
Aren't you, at some point?
Pardon?
That's an
3 years,
payment.
3 or 4 years, no interest. The state's got us in a predicament. I'm trying to keep development open.
I just want to make sure, because I wasn't sure about that. There will be a repayment on that. It's not.
Yes,
coming
down the road. On US 1, that is not the case. Route 60.
The other point that Commissioner Wheeler raised, and again, thinking out loud here, if the project is phased over a number of years, part of the problem now, part of the concern that I have now, is that if we were to pay all, again, take that 500-unit project, I pay all 500 units worth of impact fees, they all come off the system, and they're not available for anybody. And whether or not they're used or consumed for a year, 3 years, 5 years, we've created, if I'm only going to do 100 units the first year, we've created 400 units worth of ghost trips. So trying to figure out how to stop from doing that.
Right.
But if we got the intelligence to be able to figure out when those trips are coming on the road and when the road's going to need to be improved, and as part of that agreement know that, okay, you'll have concurrency in year 5 provided this road is brought up to standards in that year. I mean, the whole process is fluid. I'm not saying that we take a static count and don't assume that road is not going to be changed over the life of the project, but it would give staff some assurance that they know when the needs are going to come on over a period of time. And it seems to me it would help our planning so that we've got a better certainty of when we need to add on to our roads or improve the intersections. So, as Don has said, trying to find a win-win for everybody. And Joe, I always said a long time ago, I wouldn't argue finance with you, so I'm not, because I'll lose. But there ought to be a way that works for the private sector, helps the county with its planning, and assures that the money's going to be there when we get ready to build the roads. Because right now we all know that our road building schedule is not what we'd like it to be. The money's there, we just haven't built the roads.
Thank you, Mrs. Rick. Mr. Zork, and then Mrs. Cuff.
Morning, members of the Commission. Tim Zork, local home builder in Vero Beach. Not sure who is here before me, but they seem to be kind of anxious with what's left of their pencil. It's been some time since I've been up here. I've kind of taken a break from it after going through the whole 43rd Avenue situation, where I pointed out a number of the pitfalls that might happen if we took them out, and not like clockwork, but pretty close to it. The situations developed as I thought that they might, knowing of how the concurrency commodity market was moving and things like that. So now that's kind of correcting itself a little bit. But my comments this afternoon are, when we look at the 5 counties we've compared to, I would call every one of those counties, from a personal standpoint, traffic concurrency failures. So by them paying earlier has not deemed having successful levels of service, successful thoroughfare plans, success in any stretch of the imagination when it comes to traffic. I don't know, does anybody want to disagree with that? But paying earlier didn't solve any of those counties' problems that I can see. And I think they've probably been that way for a number of years, or let's say 3 to 5. Maybe that's been their policy. I don't think there's been any. Collier may have had the more recent changes because they've been going through some evolution in their fee schedule and their collection method. But most of the other ones, if we're going to compare ourselves to how do we do it compared to 5 failures, I don't want to do that. Why don't we compare ourselves to some places that have success rates of things that work, not to people that hey, we collect it really early, but you want to drive in any of those places? I don't. Or paid or vested earlier. I don't see where it enhanced their concurrency or their planning or their traffic
You're assuming that's a function of the attraction of the community. I mean, I've lived in Miami, I've lived in Palm Beach, and just I'll tell you one thing for sure. In Miami, I can't believe the traffic they're having there, and guess what? They're still growing at an incredible rate. So
right, but would you
to think that's a function of the way they manage their concurrency?
When we're comparing when do other people pay or vest or count?
Well, if you're going to look at a county that works, you need to find a county with really light population. They probably don't have any rules other than getting a permit for a septic tank.
I'm not talking like one of these North Georgia kind of places.
And that's the state, not the county.
No, I think there are some successes of counting and paying. One that comes to mind is Ocala. It's not a coastal community, but it's experiencing a double-digit growth rate. I don't know all the. Pardon me?
In traffic, you said Ocala?
I think Ocala, from what I've been informed through just association conversation up in Tallahassee, that there's a number of counties that have systems that the way they count and the way they pay that seem balanced between the building community, the different players that are on the table.
Sir, if I may, I have to interrupt you, though. You're trying to tell me as a traffic engineer that if I take into account the impact of a project earlier rather than later, then I'm doing something wrong.
No, I'm not saying you're doing anything wrong, but I'm saying those areas where they were counted earlier did not equal success.
I'm trying to tell you there's no correlation between the two. You can't sit there and tell me that it's wrong to consider something's impact earlier.
I'm not saying it's wrong, but if we're...
Sound like you are.
Well, I'm saying that I don't see those as they counted earlier to plan better, that I don't think their planning worked very well then. So maybe they counted correctly and they didn't plan. Something's not right. I'm just trying to differentiate. If you count earlier or you vest earlier, if you compare to the counties mentioned, I don't think those would be considered successes.
The problem is it takes 6 months to a year to build a house, a lot of them, and it takes 10 years to build a road.
Well, if you just took the timeline, and I'm sure maybe it's in one of the reports, if you get land development permit, if you look at now with our new bonding rules, I think it's 80% of infrastructure has to be in place before you could transfer a lot or apply for a permit. 75. That you're looking at from that date on a normal, let's say 40-acre development, you're probably looking at a year from land development permit to when you could apply for a permit. Then you're looking at more like 9 to 12 months from the permit being issued to an occupant living in that. So you have a 2-year window, which is a pretty long period of time. It's not a matter of months. But it used to be it was differently. I think you could, guys would get their preliminary plat one day, bond the next day. Some guys pulling a permit, and you'd have people moving in at an earlier fashion. That's now been pushed back quite a bit. The Ocala plan, and I think probably maybe somebody here might have a little bit more technical data on that, how it works, but it was one of the plans that Tom Pelham had crafted when they had some similar issues in their area. I think he's a very well educated, very well spoken person on that as the past Secretary of Community Affairs. And I think the one thing we also need to keep in mind is we just need to have a positive road growth plan for all the residents, the existing ones that have been here forever, the ones that have been born here like me, the ones that are moving here tomorrow, the ones that are going to be born tomorrow, that everybody has a nice, safe, as safe as we can, thoroughfare plan. Thank you.
Ms. Cuff.
Did I miss the point?
Maybe.
I'm sorry. I was listening very intently. I'm not trying to be rude, but
You're being rude. Would you just go ahead?
I'm not trying to be rude. I was just...
Okay.
Now we have a debate.
That vesting and counting earlier didn't equal success in any of those counties. That's. I mean, is that clear enough? Is that?
I heard you.
You can count when somebody buys a piece of property, but I don't think that counts that you're going to have a successful transportation concurrency capital improvement plan. Is that answer it?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm Adrian Cuff, 695 43rd Avenue. I think the whole idea, and this is not what I came up here to say, of comparing those counties had nothing to do with exactly comparing to Indian River. I just think that they were using those because they needed other counties' comparison for the report. But anyway, the reason I'm standing up here is because maybe I'm very naive and I'm the layperson, but my question is why, as far as being fair to everyone, and I'm including fair to all the developers. And as far as vesting, I think Joe Baird had a very valid point. You go to dinner and you have to pay for it. If we didn't pay our taxes on time this year, there wasn't any choice of, well, we could pay them next year, or we could pay them in portions. We were going to be on the delinquent tax record. That's all she wrote. That's what the law is. They don't care. That broke my arm. Now, it's nice if a developer wants to come in and buy thousands of acres or 20 acres or 40 acres or whatever they can afford. But why should we change our laws and our rules and the county bend over backwards to make some ruling so everybody's happy? I'm not going to be happy if we get 5 lanes on 43rd, but I don't think anybody cares. We're dealing with the county as a whole. And the point is that you're up here to decide what is the best for the county. Joe is there trying to juggle funds for roads. And if you have the money to buy the property and to build a complex and you can pay for it, build what you can pay for. Everything should not come to a screeching halt as far as a bank not being able to be built because there isn't concurrency on 27th, or the veterinarian not being able to build because the concurrency is sold. I mean, why do we have to turn ourselves inside out? To be fair, you want to be as fair as possible. But if you can afford to build it, pay for it, and do so. If you can build 100, you want to build 500 development, you can pay for 100 and the impact fees, then pay for it, and when you're ready, pay for the rest, and if concurrency is there, it'll be there. If not, then they'll have to plan ahead, like everybody else has to. I mean, I'm serious. Why? What am I being so naive? Why do all these exceptions have to be made? And as Mr. Baird said, what if, God forbid, someone who's building the development and has them vested drops dead and they go into bankruptcy? Then where are you going to get your money? And then what do you have to do to get the concurrency back on the road for the people that might want to buy that property if it's resold? I don't understand. Am I missing something here? As far as why does the whole county have to bend over backwards if someone is buying acreage to build 500 phased community and you have money to pay for impact fees for 100 units?
I think.
What about the other 400? Why do they have to be vested in stages? I mean, I don't understand. Why is that the case? What if the economy goes bad and only 100 sells and the others cannot be sold and goes to be built on something else? Why do you have to allow some type of system to pay for the impact fees in phases for units that are possibly never built?
People didn't want to pay impact fees until it became rare. The traffic concurrency became rare. And when ultimately where I'd like to wind up with all of this is I'd like to do away with the pending ordinance, and in the process of doing so, make it so that you can vest at LDP or at building permit as you'd like to. But the problem with that is if we lift the cap right now, everybody's going to jump on the concurrency. And what we've done is we've leveled the playing field so that individuals now, whether you're Adrian Cuff or whether you are KB Home, you now pay your impact fees and become vested all at the same time, and that is that building permit. There's a better system out there, but that better system is going to entail us modifying our system not just at the planning level, but also our system of building roads at the same time. Take away the demand for concurrency, and then we've solved the problem. Right now, we're at the dilemma, though. We don't know how to get there just yet. That's why we've hired these individuals here in front of us to help see if we're planning correctly. And then I think it's safe to say that, after we run out of money in the bank for roads, then I would say we probably are building correctly. But we're just not quite to that point, and that's why we're here looking for answers right now, is we have a system that, in my opinion, is as fair as it can be. It's not perfect. It's not where I want it to be, and it's not where I want the policy to stay forever.
Bob Keating had made a comment that in 1990 or so, I probably have the wrong date, that they had a system of paying at time.
Right.
Impact fees. But due to bad economy or something, they changed it. Is there a reason you can't go back to that original?
In my opinion, the dilemma with that is you're playing right into you're playing into the money. People that got money to Wall Street, you're playing into their hand then.
Well,
in my opinion, and it's not looking out for the little guy, and that's just my opinion.
Before they could come in and buy a piece of property, we're saying on the new proposal, staff thinks that they can only pay if they can get a land development permit, which means they have to have done all their improvements prior to us doing the pending ordinance. They could come in and just vest and take up capacity without even having the first shovel in the ground. We're not recommending that at all. We're recommending that you have to have gone through, built your subdivision, and up to the point where you can bond at the 75% point. Then you get your land development permit. Get your land development permit. That's when you can do it, which your improvements are done.
Right.
Or is it before then? Before that, but they've done all the work and they're approved. And the land development permit is when they can pay and vest.
And prior to this, we had people get turned down from P&Z, then come vest their impact fees. And it's because it was getting scarce and they could.
There's no perfect system, but we're trying to make it the best we can.
Yeah.
If I could comment a little bit on what's been said.
Thank you.
I sat on the technical committee with Palm Beach County for 2 years, updating their traffic performance standards, and they had the same issue. And what they came up with was a phasing program, that when you do your traffic study, you establish what your phases are, and they've been updating their database with all approved projects. And if you're going to build out so much in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, but ultimately you had to look at a build-out condition of everything that had been approved before you to find out if the system would work ultimately, and then back off. When you get an approval, you are locked into the time frame that you say in your traffic study, because most people they're coming in and saying, well, I can build my 1,000 homes in 2 years. And getting in the system, I'm only going to look 2 years in the future for my traffic study, because I can slip in because there's somebody else out there that's been approved. They're going to take 5 years to build out. So they wound up, giving away capacity twice. So what is required now is you got to do your traffic study, and then your improvements are, you don't pay your impact fee till you pull your building permits, but you've got to be locked into that traffic study. Otherwise, you got to come back through the system again. So, again, none of the systems are perfect, and most of them are reactive because they've found that it doesn't work perfectly. And Palm Beach County found that. And you folks are ahead of the game compared to a lot of other counties. But you do need, the point that John made, and I agree strongly with, is in some way, when you've approved the development order for a project, you got to find a way to look at those trips and find out when they're going to impact the system and when your capital improvement system has to be in place to accommodate it. Because as I understand it right now, if you had a corner where you had 4 shopping centers that all had been approved, or say 2 shopping centers, 2 office developments on a 2-lane by 2-lane roadway, and they all did their traffic study, but the other guys hadn't paid their impact fees. If they all pulled their permits and paid their impact fees, you'd have 4 projects, and you'd have a road system that was a disaster, because you would not have planned for the implementation. And believe me, almost that has happened in other counties where development is that hot. So that's why we're saying you need to look at all those project trips proactively. And again, the new legislation, there's 2 things that we used to have. We used to have a cost feasible network here and a needs network up there. There's no longer a needs network. It's all got to be cost feasible, and you got to be working towards that. But they've also put the ability, they call it pay as you grow. So you don't necessarily have to stop everything, but you got to have a program where you're going to have these improvements come online, so you don't get backlogged and you got to put up $46 million because the road's not going to be ready when it should be.
That's a state road. We're just doing it for the state.
Let me just tell you, the scenario that was laid out could not happen. If you had 4 shopping centers on each quadrant of an intersection, and if they all came in for permits that break the links, then they wouldn't all be approved. That's the whole process. We have they wouldn't get concurrency. They might have an approved site plan out there, but they couldn't get a building permit, they couldn't be built, they couldn't over-impact the road, because when one got concurrency, it would be vested in the system and would know it's there. When the next one came in, that one would have been considered. The scenario could not happen.
I disagree with you, Bob. If the first guy came in January and got his approval, but didn't pull his permits, didn't pay his impact fees, and then 6 months later another guy comes in, or two other guys come in almost simultaneously, and they're not required to look at the traffic of the approved two developments.
No, they
and
are.
Within a space of 18 months, you could have 4 approvals, but they're not in your system.
You have 4 approvals, but they can't get building permits. They can't get building permits because they got to pay concurrency. And we do the test each time. We look at the database. We look at what's vested. If one shopping center, they can all have site plan approval, but each one needs to pay his impact fee when we do the concurrency test. The scenario could not happen.
Chuck?
Chuck Meckling, 1999 Point West Drive. If I could just very simply, I want to bring forth a concept so we can look at all things when we discuss this. We're just turning in a development that we're going to try and address part of the attainable housing needs in Indian River County, and I'm just here to do a scenario of numbers. The first phase of this will be 109 lots. It'll be a low density, 2.25 units to the acre. It'll have 80% of the project open space. Of those 109 lots, if we were to pay the impact fees all up front, that would be $1,635,000 approximately right out of the gate to try and do attainable housing. Then there would be monthly base service charges for water and sewer that would come in, and that would equate to about $2,855 a month additional. All I'm trying to say in this is us as a county of Indian River, we need to take care of all the situations and try and look at all the different sides to this. I think there's been a lot of great discussion today. Over a year ago, Commissioner Davis had discussed with the Commission some concepts that would have taken place in the summer of 2005, and at that time there was discussion, and I agree that we need for proper planning to count what's out there. What we do with it in regards to concurrency is part of the debate today. One of the things that got discussed last year was the idea of paying your road impact fees up front, because there is a need for cash flow for the road system. I don't think anybody's in disagreement with that. I realize some of the counties that were in this study postponed the payment, or they allowed people to have capacity reservation and payment, but payment was at some later date. The concept that was discussed last summer then was when you come in for your building permit, you have to pay the balance of all your impact fees. So this would give a quicker cash flow on the front end. It would allow the roads to be built, and it would create a planning stage that could be followed through within the county. It's just a thought in its talking points. Thanks.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Fowler. Well, wait a minute. I think George had a comment a little while ago.
Explain something to me. If we have phasing and you pay at the land development permit period, in other words, everybody comes in like he suggested in other places, but we say you take your own bite of the apple. You got 500 units, you want to do 250 and 250, or you want to do 100, 200, whatever. Well, how does that affect what George is trying to get on when we see these at P&Z? How much does that speed up, or how much does that put in the system by going back to the land development permit time? I mean, what does that do timing-wise?
Well, I think
we've got two issues. We keep asking about planning. You all are worrying about concurrency, which is fine. And I like the idea of the pay as pay, and you take your own plan. You say you want a third of it, you go a third, that's fine, but you pay as you go. And then that part's easy to me, but I don't understand what it's doing for us in planning.
Well, what I was just saying, a developer can come in and he can have his project in phases rather than have part of it approved.
Okay.
And
using the land development permit period, when does it show up on what we look at for the next development?
When Well, I'll have Bob answer when it's paid. Bob's better at articulating that than I was. But when it's paid. But what we're trying to do, it's a delicate balance here. You know, we have the residents who we're widening all these roads, and they say, "Hey, you're looking out for the developer, not me." You know, it's always a delicate balance. You know, like Mrs. Cuff got up and said, you know, "Hey, you know, no one cared about me widening." You know, there's always a problem somewhere. But I think the safest way.
I like phasing. I think phasing.
And the developer has that option. He can break it in phases.
You decide how much you want and you pay it. But I'm not sure where that fits into what we've been asking. That's all.
What are you asking?
On time frame. When do we see the numbers? You've got one project presented to us today. Next 2 weeks, you've got another project. When do we start seeing the numbers building?
Did you see the numbers from the traffic engineer? Is that the numbers you're talking about?
I think what
Bob does.
I think what you're looking for is a vested network, which is the people have paid, and we know that's going to happen. And you've got an approved network, which could happen, but they haven't paid, and they won't get to build until they do pay.
But by declaring and phasing, we kind of can build in the planned network.
Even if they've only vested 100 trips, you need to know that those other 400 could be out there so that you can do your planning for the road. Even if they may not come in and pay, the road may get delayed because they don't pay. But at least you need to know what could be required of your road system, whether it's a vested system or not, and that's two different things.
Well, if he pays, let's say he's got a subdivision that's 500, doesn't phase it, does 100. Well, as long as he pays his impact fees, and we do that, he does 100. We can't guarantee the other 400. That's his risk, but we financed it, and we won't issue the land development permit unless we have capacity on the roads.
He takes his swipe at the apple. If he wants all 500, fine.
At his discretion. I guess really the problem with that is, though, is if they did that in the system we're in right now, it'd break, after about the third person. And now that we've got a policy, now we need to go back to what you were talking about as far as the implementing of it.
Bob's standing up, but I got to ask him a question. You said several times that you think this system as we have it now is working pretty good.
Not with the pending ordinance. Not with. I think what we're looking at and what we're doing in the draft ordinance is trying to come up with the first time an applicant should be allowed to vest and the last point that he has to vest. And what we've been kicking around and seems to be a consensus is the first point would be when he has a complete land development permit application in. And the reason for that is the applicant then is going to make a multi-million-dollar horizontal construction investment, and he should have the ability to mitigate the risk that concurrency won't be available. And it's going to be a short period of time before he's building houses. I mean, short in a year. Now, as to the last point, where he has to vest, we're kicking around final plat approval. Because at that time, the lots will be created. They're there, and they're available. And if those lots are vested, and actually vested forever, we're not going to have the possibility of some subsequent buyer getting those lots and not having concurrency. So those are the time frames we're kicking around right now, and they're really pretty reasonable. I think they allow a developer to mitigate risk on the front end at the LDP complete application time, and then eliminate the risk for subsequent buyers by having a final vesting at final plat.
May I ask Mr. Keating a question?
Yes, certainly.
All right. So what you're saying is if a developer comes in and he gives you an application for a subdivision, he can vest then?
No. He would have to have gotten preliminary plat approval.
Okay.
And then he would have to come and have all of his engineering done to submit a complete land development permit application.
Okay.
That's a pretty significant nut to crack.
I have a question on that. So the developer comes in, he does all this work, he gets the land development.
He actually has a complete application for the LDP.
He's got the land development permit, or he's got the preliminary plat approval?
He would have to already have gotten preliminary plat approval.
Okay. All right. So he's got his, but the earliest he can vest is when he gets his preliminary plat approval? Okay, the earliest he can vest is when he gets his land development permit, and he can start bulldozing dirt.
Actually, what we kicked around was when he submits a complete land development permit application, which is pretty significant.
And then, but he doesn't have to vest until he gets his building permit. Now,
No, he would have to at final plat.
Okay.
And again, these are
Gotcha.
options that are being kicked around right now.
And I like these options. I just have one question. What about all the subdivisions out there that already do have their land development applications in that are not counted? When do we count them?
We do.
Yeah,
and
when
that's
do we
the-
count them?
That's what you were talking about.
Let's get back. We got two things. We got concurrency, that's regulation, where we're going to tell someone he can't build because there aren't enough trips on the road. We don't count non-vested land use, non-vested trips at that time. For planning purposes, we have a sophisticated travel demand forecasting model. We project socioeconomic data in all of our 154 traffic analysis zones. We do long-range planning. The MPO knows which roads need to be built in the near future. That's the planning part of it. So really, both bases are covered.
Okay, but Mr. Keating, let's say I come in today for my final plat, and I'm going to pull my vesting. But right behind me is a guy who got his final plat a year ago, but because of the pending ordinance, he couldn't vest. Now, he's standing right behind me, pending ordinance has gone away. He's got final plat, I got final plat. I'm vesting, he wants to vest. When do we, what happens if the vesting's already gone because he's standing behind me?
Which is real.
Right. There are several options. Prop share. Basically, if the vesting's gone, that means we need to make an improvement in the system to get more capacity. And that's why we need money up front with payment of impact fees. And one way to do this is through the proportionate share.
Bob, I think the question that's being asked is, if you go your route, and if the projects that have land development approval exceed capacity, how do you choose which one will be permitted to pay the impact fee and vest? You've got 5 projects that are at that stage, and you can only approve 2. How are you going to choose which 2? And they're all sitting there with the money and the checks.
It's first come, first served.
Well, should they line up today outside and wait for this ordinance?
Yeah. I think when we go through the process, when the ordinance, we're going to be dealing with that, we can come up with alternatives. It could be a lottery or it could be something else. I mean, right now, we're leaning towards first come, first served.
We would be accused of preferential treatment if we did anything else. We'd be accused of picking a phone up to our favorite developer or having a secret meeting. You just never know. And so what we would do is first come, first served.
Mr. Paladin, you have a comment?
Joseph Paladin, Chairman of the Growth Awareness Committee, and also a builder and developer here in town. Let me make a comment on the last subject first, because it's the freshest in our mind. My theory would be, and how we decide who would vest first, last, second, third, or 10th, would be if we're going to let people vest at LDP is the first time, which was my earlier scenario before the pending ordinance. I'd say the earliest dated LDP would get first shot. If he didn't exercise that shot, then we go to the next guy, and then go to the next guy. So then you're not taking any preferential treatment. You're taking the guy that's been there the longest, the guy that was there first. And then you have an actual system where it's not guesswork or standing in line seeing who's got the check there first. Give the guy that's got the earliest dated LDP first shot. If he doesn't take that shot, he loses his chance. There's a system.
Well,
I think that there you have a scenario that you can exercise that's based on some fact, the date of your LDP.
And so everybody that has a house in let's suppose I bought a lot in a subdivision in 1991, though, where would I fit into that if I get ready to pull a building permit?
You'd be de minimis.
In 91?
In 91 he would. Oh.
I'd be out there mad at whoever has the earliest application.
Well, listen, we don't have all the answers to all the questions. I don't know how you want to adjust that. But here's the point.
With them de minimis?
Yeah, and the rules, de minimis.
Say any subdivision that was...
Or individual lot owner?
Yeah. Why is 1990 so sacrosanct? I mean,
because that's when the state
2001.
required concurrency.
Let me ask you a question on Mr. Swift's proposal. That seemed to be Mr. Swift.
He's back. You better ask him.
All right. Bob, you mind?
Could you take it outside?
I've been asked to do that before. Yeah, the squeeze is worth the juice.
Okay.
All right, I'll very reluctantly, but I reserve the right not to answer any questions that may embarrass me.
There.
Have you been sworn in?
Can't afford you, Brian.
Got any lawyers in here?
There seems to be some support for what you proposed. So let me make sure I understand it. If you come in... No, I didn't...
Phasing, he's phasing.
This is not rehearsed, I'm sure.
If you say if you had 500 units in your subdivision and you bonded it out or put a letter of credit in or whatever you proposed, and then they would take 20% of that a year for 5 years. Is that right so far?
That could be one scenario.
Okay, so at that point, when they took the first 20%, how many of those 500 units would be vested?
20%.
20%.
Okay, now say, okay, let's take a solid number. Let's take 100 trips on before delinquent or negative. And let's say that for concurrency purposes, that's why we're vesting. Say another person came in with 500 units, and he did the same thing, gave Joe a letter of credit or a bond. He would be good for 500, for only 100 of those 500 units.
Well, I think Joe, we have to really look at this on a true phasing basis, on a sliding needs basis. If those 100 trips today, given that road situation, met concurrency, and the other 100 units met concurrency, but projecting out 3 years down the road that there is a problem, then the next guy in, would have to go proportionate share.
But what I'm saying, by vesting there's only 100%. We only have 100%. I'm just making a scenario here. If you take that 100% up and you vested for the whole 500 units, and by the time you get to the 300 units, 4 year are out of concurrency, then the bond and the letter of credit, you would think you were guaranteed your vesting at that point, and Joe would think he was guaranteed that money for planning purposes on building roads, but you wouldn't have concurrency, and Joe wouldn't have the right to take your money at that point. Is that right?
Exactly. If you look at the system and you say you know that you've got determinable needs coming over a period of time, and as more people come in and you begin overlaying the phasing for those projects, then you can start getting a realistic snapshot of where that road's going to be 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. Now, I'm not a traffic engineer. I don't really know the ins and outs of the best way to do it, but if Mr. McMahon did it in Palm Beach County, probably figure out a system that would work here in Indian River County. All I'm trying to get to, Joe, is a system that's fair and equitable for everybody, that doesn't break the back of the system today, because if everybody came in that's been waiting for the last 8 months and demanded their, or tried to pay their impact fees tomorrow or whenever we get the new ordinance in, we'd have a problem. We'd have a real problem on our hands.
He's not guaranteed.
Well, that's the dilemma. He's guaranteeing his money, but not getting vesting. I'm curious. The reason I think that you don't need to do what Bob wants, but is phasing anyway, is that with proportionate share at that line, however we come up with it, the line forms in the rear. There's an additional cost above the normal impact fees, but it may be 10% or whatever. So at some point, I don't know, a big developer, why would you come in and spend 500 units if you really, in your own plan, take your own bite at the apple, are going to do 200 in 3 years? Why not do the 200 and you know you're going to get the 300 because you're going to have, but you may have to put up a little extra money later. There's a cost of funds here. Why would they buy down? Why would a big developer buy down 5,000 units at one time when he knows that you can do proportionate share later? So I think that if you make people if you go to phasing initially because of fear, now you may have a little bigger lump number than what we would like to see, but I think over time it'll adjust itself and they'll get close to what they really need, because you're never going to run out of concurrency if you pay the price under proportionate share.
Well, and you're assuming that we have a project that's negative that's viably feasible to pay into. If you have a negative link on a road that you don't have a feasibly financial project, then you can't do a pay-as-you-go proportionate share. So then that would be a good reason.
You have to do developers agreement.
You can't do you can't do a developer's agreement if you have a negative link unless you can correct that link. If you don't have a financially feasible project to pay into, that you're not doing the actual road work, you can't go forward with a developer's agreement.
But the developer can fix that. If he wants to lay out the money, he can fix that.
Not on a state road.
A developer on 510
wow.
that's got a 100-unit subdivision can't repair State Road 1.
I'm not, all right, I wasn't thinking State Road.
If State Road 1 wasn't part of that study,
You're right.
then you wouldn't have that problem.
You're absolutely right, Mr. Pallett. On the state road, you're right. Good.
But anyway, can you see the problem you would run into?
Lots of problems.
Pardon me?
Lots of problems.
Lots of problems. Exactly. Now, when we did the pending ordinance, the county did the pending ordinance, and I'm not speaking for everybody because I made that mistake a few other times and I was corrected that no, it wasn't my idea, but it was my idea and I did stand behind it 100%. We didn't do that as an action. We did that as a reaction to what was occurring. We reacted to the problems that we're having at that time, like on 27th Avenue and like what was happening on 510 and Highway 1. We were afraid that the big developers, and I say we, the local community that supported us on this, we were afraid that the local developers would be squeezed out because the big developers could afford to write the check for the impact fees. And even though WCI hadn't broke ground yet, they still got all their trips vested, and it's just like they exist. So that was a reason for supporting the pending ordinance. When we did support the pending ordinance, we talked about not being forever, not being a genius idea by a long shot. I never said it was an answer to everything. And I said that when we came out of it, that I agreed the best time I thought to vest and pay your impact fees would be at LDP, before you put the first shovel into the ground. And I thought you should vest, or you'd be mandatory vesting at final plat, because Gary and I had this conversation in particular. That guarantees the end user he can always buy that lot and build on it. So if somebody can't buy a lot and someday 5 or 6 or 7 years from now not be able to build on it. Used to be 5 years, you lost that, but now if you vest at final plat, when we do a new ordinance, it'd be vested forever. So those are the reasons for those time frames. And I'm not against that. But taking what George Christopher said, let's get all the facts and see where we are. You can't ask people to agree to something if they don't know if they're going to put themselves out of business. If they know that's the option and they know they're going to put themselves out of business and they still want to be a hero and do it, God bless America, we'll do it. But if they feel a little selfish and think they want to support their family, you can't ask them to make a decision not knowing what the outcome is. And so George Christopher is saying, give me the facts and we can make an intelligent decision. And the other thing is, I think where we're getting confused, this vesting and payment of impact fees, concurrency, counting, we're all picking up little things that we feel that suit our needs and working that into what the system is that we think it should be. George is very, very distinguishedly separated two separate problems, counting and concurrency. Until recently, we almost thought that was impossible to do. Now we're starting to think a little more outside the box, and we're thinking maybe it's possible to count and have a different ledger for concurrency while still having the same set of books. So, subsidiary. I'll let the terminology up to Joe. But, I don't have a problem with that. But we can't take what some of the other counties did on the surface without knowing the end result or what they did to get to that result. As far as loading all the trips that they have in West Palm Beach or somewhere else onto the model and keeping them there without any, setup as far as bringing them into the system, that's not the answer. That's not what they did. No one could do that unless you were living in a two-horse town. And I always, if you got two Publixes, you couldn't do it. It's just that simple. So you got to get all the facts before you take the pieces of it you want to hear and decide it might work. But I'm not against writing a new ordinance that'll work, that'll let people vest, that want to put money into the ground. I think that's fair. I'm not against making it mandatory at final plat. I think that's fair. What I'm against is all of us trying to make decisions when I don't think there's two people who maybe have all the facts, and maybe one of those two people understand all the facts.
Well,
I just don't want to make a decision.
To explain my program, and what I said to you was that we're doing a lot of thinking out loud or talking out loud here. All of the suggestions that have been raised today create issues for somebody. And I'm certainly not smart enough to say I've got the perfect answer. I'm just trying to find a system or suggest that there's a route to a system that is fair and equitable, that provides a good planning tool for the county, which George and P&Z are looking for, provides a reasonable financial tool for the improvements that are needed, as Joe and his staff is looking for, and provides a system that can be managed that Bob and Chris and his staff look for. And we got some bright people around here. We ought to be able to figure out. And remind you, when we talked about this before, that you were in favor of the phasing. You said you wouldn't argue with me about it. So.
I wouldn't argue with you about phasing. Phasing a project, I have no problem with that. I have no problem with that whatsoever. And a lot of smaller developers, that's the way they can afford to go in and invest part of their project.
But there needs to be, and I'll go back to the word predictability. I'm not looking, no one's looking for a free ride. But there's got to be predictability all the way around on all sides. And that's, if we can come up with a system that provides some measure of fair predictability, then I think everybody may not be happy, but that's kind of the definition of a compromise, right? Everybody's a little bit unhappy about it.
Mr. Chairman.
Well, Mr. Bell, he had advice from his attorney on this side of the room. You want to find an attorney over here?
I haven't in the several years you've known me.
We've got.
Make that very clear. I'm not his lawyer.
Believe me, he couldn't make it clear enough.
Must be you're going to lose, Bob.
Gary.
We've been kicking this around now for about 3 hours, and Mr. Keating and staff are working on a proposal. They've got the input from the consultant. Anything we're going to do is going to have public hearings before it's adopted, and I think we can get all back into this again with a target, maybe with proposal from staff that's not moving every minute. I just see this as we're just covering the same ground over and over and over again from a different
we just rambling back and forth and debating.
I agree with you.
Got to go through this again when the ordinance.
I agree with you. And let me wind up. I mean, a lot of people ask me, well, what makes you think roads are going to get built? They haven't been built before. Well, we're doing a lot more things that we didn't do back then. We really pushed that road program forward. And we're doing developers agreements with developers where they can't finish the development without doing off-site road improvements. We have a lot of things we're doing now we didn't do years ago. Second thing I hear a lot is Joe Bear's got a ton of money in the bank. Why do we need to pay impact fees? Well, Joe Bear only got a ton of money in the bank for the county because we haven't done nothing. Once we start buying up all this right-of-way at the pace we are, and once we start building roads, the man needs the money to keep it going, in my opinion. So, and the third thing I want to say before I wind it up is there's a lot of questions here. There's a lot of people that think they're right. There's a lot of people that think that I'm wrong and other people are wrong. We're probably, according to what everybody that the consultant has said to us and everybody else that I know in different counties, we're probably one of the best organized counties for doing our concurrency and having an actual count. We may not have all the roads built we should, but we are correcting that. And I want to look at the people that got us here. If there's going to be a gray area, I don't want to go with somebody new. I like the people that got us here. So if I'm not 100% sure of myself, those guys are okay for me. That's all I have to say.
Yeah.
Well put.
I'd like to say, too, this commission right from the get-go has been very, I think, proactive in trying to push ahead roads as much as we possibly can and made that a priority across the board here. So, we're moving in that direction.
I think so.
I've got a couple comments. Joe, do you still think that we're the model program for the DCA after what you heard today? John, I mean, see, I've been sitting here for too long.
No, I think
That's true.
you've got your act together. I mean, I've worked in a lot of counties.
Would you use the mic, please?
Well, another thing I'd like to make a comment on too today, Mr. Chairman. I know we never did, I guess, get to item number 6 because of item number 7. I wish
that's been ongoing.
Yeah, well, I wish we'd have had more input from the planning and zoning because they have been hit head on with a lot of these issues and have gotten a lot more input from them, and I don't think we had enough from them today, to tell you the truth.
Well, I think they've just been questioning the traffic reports mainly. I think they were never happy with the traffic reports, and I don't know why that was, because apparently our staff was happy with the traffic reports. But it initiated all this dialogue we're having now.
Right. Right. Well, many of the scope and all of the questions grew from concerns from the Planning and Zoning Board originally. There was just one procedural thing that I wanted to go through while John was still here, and that was the one question that has come up again and again in front of Planning and Zoning was the ability of consultants to vary or change or alter the traffic capacity of a road by using an individual arterial analysis. And while you're here, John, I just wanted to see what your opinion was of that and what other counties do.
Yes, most of the, and I don't know exactly, but the trend was to allow different input values, if you will, for some of the software that we use, typically specific to field data. You know, if you go out, you allow, and again, you don't have to accept it, but you certainly have to at least look at it and see if it's reasonable. If I come back to Chris and I say, look, I did my percentage of right turns is 20 instead of, 12. Chris is likely to accept that if I have traffic data that shows that. So it's not uncommon for other counties to allow, because most of our software have default values because a lot of them are planning tools. So in some cases the roads don't even exist yet. So you have some default, which is a typical, minimum, if you will. But yes, I think there's nothing wrong with accepting different input values as long as you have field data to substantiate them.
Okay. Mr. Christopher, you have a comment?
Yes, could I don't want to talk about concurrency, and I think, as Gary said, you're going to need public hearings and an ordinance to deal with concurrency. You don't need an ordinance to direct that the facts be determined. And with that in mind, I'd like to ask the consultants a question, and that is, we've got a lot of approved projects. Traffic studies have been done on them, but the data hasn't been piled into a planning system. If the commissioners wanted a planning ledger, how long would it take? Is it an extremely complicated thing? How long should it take to get those facts into the database so that you could see what the demands are of the approved projects?
John is laughing.
Go, boss. Well, Bob probably has the information.
Yeah, we did an estimate of that, and we gave it to P&Z. I think we estimated 1,000 or 1,500 man-hours, staff hours, and it would take a long time. And the other thing you have to remember is this is dynamic. Those trips are not just one point in time. When there's a CO, trips come out. When there's approval, trips come in. We have, right now, it would be costly and time-consuming to get it in. And the other issue is I'm not sure where the in is. It would be a logistical problem with our computer system right now. But just remember, they're dynamic trips. They're not static.
Mr. Chairman, a year and a half ago, Bob said it would take 1,000 hours, and he also said the information would be irrelevant. Now, assuming I'd like the consultants to answer the question, and the second part of my question is it something they could do?
I'm sure they could.
Over what period of time would it take?
Could I add something to your...
Well, let's have an answer from the consultants first. Can you give us something off the top
Palm
of your
Beach
head?
County is doing an update currently, and I appreciate the compliment earlier, but I did not put that new TPS, Transportation Planning System, together myself. There were 25 members on that committee, so it was a very involved process. But what came out of that was establishing a database to put all the traffic in there, tied it to the different roads, and tied it to a phasing program. That system in Palm Beach County is, it's at least probably 3,000 hours. And it's a much bigger county and a lot more.
Yeah.
So I can't, and I'm not knowing the familiarity with how your system would adapt. Your concurrency system may well be much more adaptable to it, and you have a smaller county, so that 1,000 hours might be pretty much right on. And the answer to the other question is yes, we do that kind of work.
Okay, George Hamner.
Art, real quick, the dilemma I have had with this, and I think we all would like to see the information, and you all know what it's like to vote on an issue, all right? Now we've got the information in our data, a project is in front of us, and because we've added the information for planning purposes, we show failures in roads, left, right, intersections. But technically, unless we've changed our concurrency rules, what do we tell the applicant? As P&Z, do we deny the application because the planning information shows that we're overloaded because we've added this other data, and that's why this overlap, you hear one of us talk about planning, the other talks about concurrency, because, I mean, if we're planning and zoning, we've got to approve or deny projects. Can we do that on information, or do we have to do it on rules? And that's part of what...
You do it, concurrency is provided by the engineers, is it not, before it comes to you?
Exactly, but I mean...
Do they say it's concurrent?
Are we going to add these projects into the concurrency system, or are we just going to add them in for planning purposes? And I mean, it's you all's decision, not ours, and that's that policy we're looking for.
And that's what we're looking for, is when the system is going to fail. I've heard that sentence from you before, letting us know when the system will fail.
I think we had a project, the bank failed because of lack of concurrency, did it not?
But that was... Anything will fail for lack of concurrency, or it should.
No, but I think his question specifically is, okay, we do what Mr. Christopher's asking. Do we deny a project because there's current concurrency? The engineers say it, but the question is we have on the planning side of it, if we can theoretically say, if these come in tomorrow, this link will fail. Now, do we deny it based on if?
We base it on what the engineer says about the traffic.
So we base it on concurrency, not the planning side of it.
Yeah.
But that's what Mr. Paladin picked out. That's what Mr. Paladin pointed out, that this is not just a concurrency issue. This is a concurrency issue and a planning issue. Those figures are only being used for planning. If there's concurrency, that project gets approved. If there's no concurrency, he doesn't get approved. But at least we got this plan that says, guess what, guys? 37th is going to fail in 2 years. We got to get working on it now. We need rights of way. We need this. We need that. It's a planning tool.
If this will move Joe and Jim along, that's fine. More roads, faster. And you've solved this with asphalt. The quicker, the better.
Well, we agree that that's the major problem, is getting the roads done. But we're not alone in the state, and we've made big strides this year.
Somebody told me the other day they couldn't get from Sebastian to Vero because 2 roads had construction taking place. That's a compliment.
Bob Bruce, did you have your hand up? Or?
Yes, I did. I guess one thing that we all seem to forget is that we can build houses faster than we can build roads.
We're caught behind the curve. One thing I know, that if the building boom just slows down a little bit and the traffic, the road building speeds up, that somewhere in the next 10 years the bubble might be over. I may not be here to see it. I won't be here to see it, but anyway.
Oh, now, Art.
I mean, here.
My card?
I'll be out there fighting the traffic.
I hope so higher. Let me give you my business card.
You ought to all try being chairman. You get so much respect up here.
I've been there.
Mr.
Doug Cup, 43rd Avenue. I don't know how many lay people are still here. I've got a question that seems kind of obvious to me, but where does the street size end?
Street size?
Lanes? No, when do you say the width is there. We're talking eminent domain, we're talking all these things on the outside. I want to know if we're playing this concurrency game and the street is, if there's this many lots, when is 43rd Avenue going to become 10 lanes?
Not
Hold
likely.
up. Oh, right, but that's what I'm asking. Who has got the figure on, okay, 43rd Avenue can only be? Where are the maximums on these things? Where is the final ending point for this? What is going to happen when these two developed, the shopping centers out by Home Depot go in? How wide can you make 58th at Route 60? You are going to be at service level F no matter what. There is no end to this. So, I mean, I don't. Somehow, I'm kind of wondering why. If you build it out completely, then does development stop? Is there an end to that?
Well, you make alternate routes. 26th Street will be a route, 53rd Street will be a route, and 16th Street out west is going to be an east-west. So.
66th, and actually with 43rd, Doug, I think if Oslo, and you've heard me say it before, if Oslo Road would have been 5-laned before those developments, I think 43rd probably would have less traffic on it now. But as 43rd gets widened and 8th Street gets widened and 4th Street gets widened, if that be the case, it's the offshoot roads and 66 gets in place. Unfortunately, we are way behind the curve.
But there is an end to this, correct?
Yeah, basically,
4 lanes is an end.
It's going to end when more people start moving out than are moving in. Other than that, it ain't ever going to end.
Let's check our pulses.
And I think that's a valid point, and he has a good question. It is never going to end, depending on who's sitting up here.
That's right.
And it's, all you have to do is look at Miami. There is no
No
end
end.
of it.
Perpetual
There's just
construction.
redeveloping, and they're building to the sky. And the roads are so congested, you can go sit through 4 traffic lights and still not move.
More than
So
And even no matter what we do setting up here, we're going to get crushed from the north and the south with density and growth. St. Lucie County and Brevard County, no matter, even here, I mean, if we maintain, I mean, it's common.
Just everybody remember that my first meeting here, I was very delinquent. I've lived here for 35 years, and it's only been a couple of years since I've been, even saw the inside of this building. The statement was made, and it was assured, we will never be Palm Beach County. We can never be one of those cities.
Because they'll be always ahead of us.
Oh, is that's it? Thank you. That's probably the most honesty I've heard. We will be, if you don't watch out. And no matter what anybody has told you, it's heading that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Guy. It's after 5 o'clock. Is there anything else to come before this body? Has everyone vented and told us their ideas?
For the moment.
Consultants, you need to wrap up or anything? Our staff, Bob?
Hey, you've gone far enough.
We've gone far enough. Okay.
Are they still on the clock? I mean, can we still?
I'm sure they are.
Are we? Have we used up our 15,000? Is what I'm saying, or do we still? Can we still ask them questions like?
You want to pay him in favor?
You can take him home with you tonight. Yeah. Take him out to dinner.
We'll let her credit for that. I'll bet.
We're only 20% vested.
But I'd like to hear, because of what they've heard today, I'd like to hear their recommendations on what we should be doing about all the things that we batted around today.
I think it's
I
in
mean,
there.
how do we put these numbers on the books?
They've
Do we
already
put
given
these
it to
numbers
us.
on the
It's all
books?
in there.
Want to run.
Yeah, their recommendation would be to get a new contract and they can fix it.
That's right.
Well, I think logistically, they've submitted a draft report.
Yeah.
They're going to be looking to finalize a report, put something together. I think from staff's perspective, what we'd like is some direction as far as do we turn them loose to put together as maybe a summary of today's meeting, and or do we give them some direction as far as just finalize your report based on what we've discussed here today? I don't think we've come to the end of a lot of issues, but
Well, definitely use what they've heard here today and finalize the report and come back to us one more time.
Okay.
Without a doubt.
And-
And
and-
I'm sure there'll be some conversation with you people and staff and to pull something
they'll have
together.
to
Bob
do-
said he's
Yes.
got some ideas he's working on with planning and concurrency.
And I think they understand the pending ordinance doctrine too. You all have heard that. Obviously, staff understands that. That's a big issue too.
I'd like to start trying to find a policy to lift that ordinance.
Yeah.
And make it so that.
Well, they're working on that now.
Yeah, I mean, and as it comes forward, let that be a part of the package. I mean, it was just a short-term solution to a long-term problem. Let's find a long-term solution to the problem.
And planning and zoning is always on the front line, and that they do need some concrete information that they can determine is valid.
We will refine our report. We'll take some input from staff, and we'll get back to you.
Great.
Thank you.
Fair enough.
Appreciate the
If there's
time.
no other business to come before us, I'll call us adjourned.
Thanks.